Welcome to the fourth annual conference of Mitvim Institute, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policy. I'm Merav Kahana-Dagan, the deputy head of the Institute, and I'm excited to open this event, which in the spirit of the time is held on Zoom and not face-to-face as we normally like to have it. I would like to thank all those who are with us. We have ambassadors and diplomats, members of Knesset, guests from different countries in the world, partners along the way. I would also like to thank all the speakers who will be here with us and the staff of the Mitvim Institute who happily grows and expands in the last few years. Dr. Nimrod Goren, the head of the Institute, Dr. Roee, Kibrik, Gabriel, Dr. Sion, Tzidkiyahu, Dr. Leon Leres, former MK Ksenia Svetlova, Arnold Spiekel, Elie and Eric Zaga, our technology advisor who is here to help us with technological issues, and you can approach him on the chat. I'd like to in particularly thank the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung for their support and partnership in this conference, but mostly for this many years partnership, your trust and faith and support that you give. I'd like to personally thank Dr. Pasch and Mitvim for working together on a number of projects which lie at the very core of the Institute. To those of you who do not know us as well, and that's the first time you join us, I'd like to tell you that the Mitvim Institute was established in 2011 as a research institute aiming to improve foreign policy of Israel, enhancing the foreign relations, and enhancing the integration of the State of Israel in its nearby vicinities, Europe and the Mediterranean Basin, and also to advance Israeli-Palestinian peace. In the framework of the work of the Institute, we generate knowledge and advance recommendations by conducting studies, writing articles and position papers, conducting polls and surveys, and publishing monthly reports. We invest much effort in working with MKs, government agencies, NGOs, media outlets, foreign diplomats, and other think tanks around the world. All this is what we do together with the staff of the Institute and very vast network of researchers, policy fellows, and think tanks, and that's a good opportunity to thank them all. A bit about this year that is something that we're still undergoing. Year 2020 will most probably be remembered as a very special year, a year in which the entire world, as well as we, was impacted by COVID. On the one hand, it seems that everything was put to a stop and froze, but on the other hand, year 2020 is a year of major changes on the global as well as the regional level. Beside all those challenges, and despite them, we continue to strive for amending Israel's foreign policy. In some places, we see progress and developments, but in other places, we still haven't. This past year, we managed to advance a joint work with MKs, ministers, and government agencies to improve foreign policy, to strengthen the Israeli relations, foreign relations. We held political dialogues with think tanks and experts from Jordan, the PA, the Emirates, and Turkey. We wanted to highlight the importance of our relations with the EU, and we assisted in improving our relations with them. Earlier on this month, we published the Index of Israeli Foreign Policy for year 2020. This is the annual study that we conduct this 8th year in a row by the Rafi Smith Institute together with the FES, and you'll be able to find it on our website. In our event today, we'll have two sessions and two rounds of political perspectives. The first one will deal with Israel's relations with the Middle East, Europe, and the Mediterranean Basin, after which Ofer Shelah, MK Ofer Shelah, and Minister Orit Farkash Hacohen will give their addresses. In the second session, we'll deal with Israeli diplomacy in Arab countries and the Islamic countries, after which member of Knesset Nitzan Horowitz and Minister Aida Suleiman will be giving their address. So this event is broadcast and recorded. It is broadcast on Facebook and YouTube. Please make sure that your mics are turned off. If you have any questions, you can write them in the chat, and the coordinators will collect them all. I'm honored to invite Dr. Pasch, the director of the Ebert Fund here in Israel, to give his address.
Thank you very much, Merav. I'm also very excited. This is the 4th annual conference of Mitvim. I learned that anything that happens more than 3 times you can call traditional. So now we have a tradition of Mitvim annual conferences, and that is something very positive for Israel, for the region, for our relations between Israel and Europe. Shalom to everybody, to the members of Knesset, to the colleagues, to the friends, to the distinguished diplomats. As a German, I would like to especially welcome my ambassador, Dr. Vasum Rainer. Herzlich willkommen. I would like to mention only a few points in this very important cooperation that we have with Mitvim. We are honored to can consider ourselves as a strategic partner of Mitvim since it was founded in 2011. And we are especially proud that Mitvim is among the very, very few organizations that is still conducting policy dialogue with Turkey, with Turkish colleagues, with Palestinian colleagues, with colleagues from Jordan, and also with a lot of think tanks and organizations that are involved in the East-Med dialogue. The Foreign Policy Index was already mentioned by Merav. What the people of Mitvim don't like to talk about too much is their successful ranking in the think tank index of the University of Pennsylvania. And I do believe that this is really something that they can be very, very proud of. We as Friedrich-Ebert Foundation are also ranked quite well, but we have an annual budget of 190 million euros, and we have more than 600 employees and offices in more than 100 countries around the world. Mitvim is working with very modest means and is ranked 20th in the category of most innovative policy ideas and 24th, among others, in the category of best regional study centers. And really heartfelt congratulations to that successful ranking that you achieved there. Mitvim plays a very important role in maintaining a dialogue with Israeli actors and the governing institutions of the European Union. This is something that is for us as a European organization of utmost importance. And at the moment, it looks like there is really some opportunity to renew and strengthen that important relationships that suffered a little bit in past years. In the recent months, since the signing of the peace and normalization agreements between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and most recently with Sudan, the very competent staff of Mitvim helped us to see and understand a little bit beyond the euphorism that was so present in Israeli public discussion and see these agreements in a different or in the right perspective. Thank you very much for that very important contribution. Last but not least, I would like to thank the whole team of Mitvim, the very competent colleagues in all the different fields for this very fruitful cooperation. My special thanks goes to Nimrod Goren and Merav Kahana-Dagan, as well as to my colleague Miki Drill, who were the key figures in organizing today's event. I wish us all interesting proceedings and discussions. Thank you very much.
Shalom lekulam.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Roee Kibrik, and I'm a research director at the Mitvim Institute, and I'm excited and proud to be here, and I'll be your moderator in the first session. And here we start. It's hard to locate Israel in one region and to affiliate it to one political regional system, to focus the Israeli foreign policy in one geographical unit that is very coherent with a very definite set of players, and quite justly so, because this is not the reality. The reality is that the state of Israel Israel is an intermediate state. It exists both in and inside and outside and here and there. And it is not for no reason that in the annual conference of the Mitvim Institute, when the Israeli public has to decide what Israel belongs to, the votes divide almost equally between the Middle East, the Mediterranean Basin, and Europe. And indeed, the State of Israel is required to operate and operates in the Middle East, in Europe, and also in the Mediterranean Basin. As part of the regional fabric, as part of the relevant power play, and in order to advance its interests in each of those regions. And of course, we need to bear in mind that these regions are not disconnected from one another, and the Israeli policy in the Mediterranean Basin is not totally detached from what is happening in the Middle East, and what happens in the Middle East is not detached from what is happening in Europe, and vice versa. The first session in our annual conference is focusing on Israel's foreign policy in these regions in this past year. Just like in any other year, this year too, there are many developments, perhaps even more than in every other year. Some of them are surprising, extremely surprising. We did not expect them. And others were initiated by Israel. Some were led by other players. And some are a derivative of outside reasons. We follow up on Israel's policy in these regions. We're trying to understand it, to describe it, to characterize it, to criticize it, and to point at the opportunities and the challenges that lie in front of the State of Israel. In the next few minutes, some of the Mitvim experts will describe the key developments that took place in different regions this past year, the processes, the successes, and sometimes the failures of the Israeli foreign policy. If you have any questions, as Merav said earlier, you can write them in the chat while things are being said, and we will make our utmost to relate to them later. And we're going to start with Professor Elie Podeh, board member of the Mitvim Institute. Podeh is from the Islam Studies and the Middle East Studies at the Jerusalem, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's going to introduce to us just an iota of what happened in the Middle East this past year. So Elie, the floor is yours. And the Zoom is yours as well. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Is everything okay? Yes? Okay. In 7 minutes, because this is what we've been given, I will indeed try to say the most important points. First of all, on a personal note, I would like to say that I am a partner, I have been a partner in Mitvim from day one, and I definitely share the pride that has been spoken about by the different speakers concerning all that has been done in the 10 years since its establishment. This past year was a very, very difficult year. But it also had its positive aspects. A year ago, I went on my sabbatical to England, and quite naturally, I was not even here in the previous annual conference. Just to remind everyone, Zoom was not something that any of us used back then, so I could not connect. And 6 months later, I was forced to return because of COVID. And we also had, on the other hand, 3 peace agreements. One with the United Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan. In other words, I would say that if a year ago, in November, someone would have told me that that's what's going to happen in this upcoming year, I would say that this is just a wild dream. Not because there's something sexy about it, but because COVID is bad and the peace agreements are good. And together, it's a dream, a bad and a good dream. That's the connection between the two. I would like to discuss not Corona, but rather the good side before I'll say a word of criticism. Most of us in Mitvim, and also me in person, we had a theory that actually much progress with our neighbors will not take place unless there is a major resolution achieved for the Palestinian conflict. And we saw that this theory did not pass the test of time. I don't think that this theory failed altogether because it is not that clear where we're going to head from here. But there's no doubt that we didn't see the entire picture, and I can point to a number of reasons why that was so. Perhaps we did not diagnose the turning point in the Arab world, the level to which they got fed up with the Palestinian cause, the determination of the Americans aiming to reach some sort of a progress vis-a-vis the Arab state, COVID, that obviously we could not foresee, along with a few other historic processes about which I have been writing and studying in the past few years, and much was happening between Israel and its neighbors. But for this part to turn into the overt part, other parts were needed, things that we could not evaluate their importance. What are the major differences that took place resulting from what happened? First of all, a major improvement in the strategic situation of the State of Israel vis-a-vis its foes. Israel in a situation in which it collaborates with many players in the Middle East. I was asked not to provide you with maps or a PowerPoint presentation, but if I showed you a map from the 50s and you could see in red all the enemies and the enemies today, you would have seen a major difference. And I do not underestimate the importance of those enemies that remain, like Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas. But Israel, as far as the strategic element is concerned, has improved its situation in a very major, definitive way. The second point is the improvement of its capabilities, economic capabilities. Israel can cooperate on the economic level with countries in the region. Jordan and Egypt were not real partners, financial partners, but if you examine the part of export and import in the comprehensive export and import of the State of Israel, then it's negligible when compared to Europe, America, and the Far East. This is about to change mostly vis-a-vis the Emirates, who are the most important player, and perhaps additional countries will come along. And obviously, the entire economic share of the State of Israel in the Middle East will have changed drastically. Another point is the improvement of Israel's image in the media and the civil society. Here, too, we have to look at the improvement in a very gradual way. It's not that now the situation has changed dramatically, but no doubt when we see the voices that come from the Gulf countries and we follow up on what is happening in the media, we see a major difference in the way by which they relate to Israel, and they themselves are saying is that the way Israel is presented in Arab media is very negative, but the way we see Israel through their eyes is totally different. And that pertains to the next change, and that is the change of the image of normalization. This concept, the concept in Arabic was always very negative throughout this time and among most of the civil society people and agencies. Here too, the change is not dramatic perhaps, but it ignites a very important transformation. I think that even now we can see that peace with the Emirates and with Bahrain, and I still hesitate about Sudan, but concerning the Gulf countries is a different piece. It is a different piece because it is essentially different to that of Jordan and Egypt. These are peace agreements that have lasted a long time. They're very stable, but they're mostly with the ruling elite, with the government, with the president. They're not with the civil society. And what you see in front of your eyes when you look at Bahrain and the Emirates, you see that what takes place here is a change that comes from the grassroots. It's not only from top to bottom. And this is why I'm using the term a different piece, because it is a piece with one that's different. In Jordan and Egypt, you do not see that kind of piece. It is a piece with the state of Israel, but there's not necessarily an inclusion of the state of Israel and the Jews as legitimate players. The Palestinian issue is definitely very much in the middle and is very, very significant. Hence, I think that all these things, and I enumerated 4 or 5 advantages, which are huge, and they have changed this past year, resulting from those peace agreements with these 3 countries. However, it is impossible to state only the good without talking about the bad. We cannot only talk about positive ramifications without expressing some words of criticism that definitely are fit at this point. we should say a few things. First of all, one has to bear in mind that we should not be dragged to some euphoric state. This euphoric state was our experience after the peace with Egypt and the Jordanians, and also perhaps with the Palestinians. But I'm saying let's take it with a grain of salt. The achievements are very nice. You have to remember that these take place at the very periphery of the Middle East at the moment. These are very interesting, important countries, mostly the Emirates, but they're still not dramatically changing the conflicts and the issues that we grapple with here in the region. Hence, we have to pay attention to the way we contend with those other places, and that means Syria and Hezbollah. And for example, the talks that commenced now with Lebanon, it's true that it's not the formal Lebanon, and it doesn't deal with peace, but rather the division of the loot, as we can call it, economic issues, energy perhaps. These are important matters, but they can open the door, and definitely the very fact that Hezbollah is partners to the Lebanese government gives them the green light, bears some good news that perhaps over time they too will play a role. And the last thing, and I assume Roee need to finish, yeah? Am I reading you correctly? Well, I have to say one thing, and perhaps that would come up later on in the questions. The key reason why, or the key thing that we have not progressed with is the Palestinian conflict. A very important thing is that the agreements with the Emirates, Bahrain and Sudan, mostly with the Emirates, provided a very important lever to these countries, namely that Israel would go in the direction of annexation. Definitely Jordan, Egypt, and the Emirates and the other Arab countries have the ability to serve as a factor that Israel would have to take into account, namely disconnecting diplomatic ties, calling back the ambassadors. All those are steps that can be taken. But the most important thing, and with that I'll end, is that it's true that we made a very nice progress without resolving the Palestinian issue, but ultimately the Palestinian issue is the very core of the conflict, and we must give some thought to it. We cannot, look the other way, look at the periphery, and assume that if we solve the problems with the periphery, we would somehow be advancing our resolution with the Palestinians. Quite the contrary, there is a possibility that in the current situation, we have already distanced this resolution, not necessarily made it anywhere nearer. And I do hope that the elections in the US will bring about a very desired change there that will bring about a change in the order of priority and force us to put the Palestinian cause in the center. Thank you very much, Elie. There will be questions, and we will allow you to elaborate on these points later on. You presented a very broad picture of what takes place in the Middle East, and quite justly you mentioned the new peace agreements, and now we will look at the relations between Israel and the Emirates in particular. The development in the relations between them actually paints what will take place in the second half of this year in the relations between Israel and the Middle East. And in order to do this, there's no one better than Dr. Moran, Zaga, who studies the United Emirates since 2006. She visited that country a number of times, and she was a partner to our research in Mitvim for almost 3 or 4 years, dealing with Israel's foreign relations with the Arab world. And she studied the relations between Israel and the United Emirates. She's a great partner, full of knowledge, and she can help us focus our attention even more on what has happened and what can still happen in the relations between Israel and the United Emirates. So Moran, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roee. Can everybody hear me? Yes, well, I'm definitely proud to be a part of Mitvim. I'd like to summarize the past 2.5 months, even though it seems like much longer than that. And I'd like to talk about how they try to present the Emirate perspective on what led them to take this this step and signed the normalization agreement with Israel. Well, many Israelis and many others who have tried to analyze this perspective, I believe, have tried to dwarf the Emirates' motivations and focused on materialist aspects of the F-35 and then various different assets. And the people from the Emirates, they tried to present something that's much broader, a strategic step, even part of a very broad vision to create a new reality in the Middle East, no less. And they have taken the first proactive measure in order to realize this dream. Is it a materialist interest? Is this a utopic ideology? Well, I'll try to suggest a more sober perspective on this. I believe that this is a formative event within a broader process, and Israel is merely a small part of it. And I'd like to tell you what I see in this process. And we've seen the UAE positioning itself as a regional superpower for years now. It underwent significant change in the previous decade between 2000 to 2010 with the leadership in four out of the Emirates and in Dubai and Abu Dhabi as well. Today, they are celebrating a decade to the leadership of Sheikh Saud al-Sakr, and this entire new leadership brought a fresh spirit to that country. And if I were to try to conclude the new spirit with two headlines, it will be accelerated development and openness. Openness is a key word with respect to this country. And this is what distinguishes it from its neighbor, Saudi Arabia, which truly is a regional superpower, but it is rather closed in. And that's a limiting factor regarding its ability to have an effect. So in this process, as it tried to establish itself as a regional hegemony, was even further enhanced, further reinforced this past decade. I think the three events that one cannot ignore, which encouraged this measure, were obviously the Arab Spring, ISIS, but mainly Qatar. All of them created this combination of a fear, a genuine fear of radicalism and the destabilization of the region. And this really came close to their home in the Gulf. And this sense of a rivalry vis-a-vis Qatar. And this rivalry can actually explain many of the measures of this country, part of the competitiveness, or we can look at it as some kind of countermeasures. This led the UAE to be very proactive in its foreign policy. So it has decided to stretch this imaginary line, if I were to try and simplify it, between the good guys and the bad guys. And it defines who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. 2019, the UAE declared a year of tolerance. This is a classic example of how it's trying to shape public opinion around this theme of the radicals against the moderates. And when it decided it wishes to become a regional superpower, it took a regional and international actions. I'll give you a few examples. You've probably all heard of them. The space program, Mars, the UN agency spirit, the branding of the Emirates, global conferences, active participation in regional wars, and mediation. And this partially linked them to Israel. We have pointed at the different steps in this rapprochement between the countries and showed how more and more elements were added to it every year. And this gave it a very high status both in the region and in the world. And as we try to look at the broader process, we see that the normalization event is yet another milestone in their attempt to strive to regional hegemony. And they have taken a measure that is perceived to be bold and reality changing. Is it within Israel's interest for the UAE to serve in this position? It's important to remember that it can have an influence in places that are important to Israel, and yet Israel cannot have any impact there. Let me give you one prominent example, Sudan. Another example could also be Syria, that the UAE has gotten much closer there since things have calmed down a bit there. And if we continue to look at things from an Israeli perspective, one could see that the general approach, general attitude towards the UAE is exceptionally positive. It has invested a lot of resources in this relationship, and there are many elements in both the government and the civil society who have striven towards that. So I have to say that until the peace accords, the UAE allowed Israelis or in Israel to participate in various international platforms that took place in its territory. The change now is not just in how public it will be now, but also in the scope and the ability to operate in areas in which they couldn't collaborate before. Science, research, tourism, diplomacy. Of course, there are areas that that the two countries obviously share, whether it's the Iranian threat, the climate crisis, and there will also be regular ties, let's say ties between banks, between touristic agencies. So I think that the relationship will not necessarily only be measured by the channels of collaboration, but also how long they will last. And the platforms we can already see, for example, government offices that are establishing teams dedicated to the relationship with the Emirates, desks that are being established in different establishments and institutions that will focus on the UAE, various forums and documents and MOUs. All that is intended to build a relationship bottom up and to make sure that this relationship continues. But there are still some obstacles. Maybe we'll address them during the Q&A session. Let me introduce yet another aspect. That's the difference between the Israeli political structure and the Emirates structure. I don't think we fully understand what it means to work with a federation country. Usually their decision making, the centralized decision making is in one layer. So it's very, very important to maintain this special relationship established with that executive level. But it's also important to understand that there are various leadership tiers, and it's important to ensure these connections, just like we see Israeli ministers today approaching the parallel ministers in the UAE. But not only that, we should also try to connect with the local leaders. There will be certain areas in which the address is these local leaders. Let's take an Israeli entrepreneur who wants to establish a solar panel farm in one of the Emirates, in one of the 7 Emirates, so Sharjah. So it will have to approach that local ministry and not the federal ministry. The Emir of Sharjah and the other emirs haven't spoken out yet about normalization, so we don't really know what their positions are and how open they truly are to this relationship with Israel. So this is yet another topic we must examine. Let me say that we can learn a lot about how the relationship between the UAE is being constructed. We can try to or aspire to copy this model to our relationships with other countries, but on the other hand, this relationship has its own uniqueness, and the Emirates, just like I tried to say, they have their own specific interests and their own nature, which perhaps does not suit other countries in the Middle East. Right now, I believe that we all agree that the challenge is to ensure the establishment of this relationship. And we must remember that just like Israel needs legitimacy in the Middle East, and this agreement did help it to a great extent today, the UAE needs this legitimization. And therefore, something that we identify that truly stands out is the desire to see other elements. The UAE would like to see others joining this measure, and there's a reason why they pressured Sudan to join, and also their aspiration to establish regional ties, not necessarily bilateral ties between Israel and the UAE. And we're talking about, a convergence of interests here that would help Israel as well to expand its network of ties if it will work towards international cooperations, which obviously will include the Palestinians, and the UAE will benefit from receiving legitimacy following the measure it took vis-a-vis Israel. Thank you very much, Moran. As you've noticed, when Moran talks about the UAE, it's very hard to stop her. She has so much to talk about, and hopefully later on we will answer some questions during the Q&A. And now let's turn our gaze away from the Middle East, westwards and northwards to another region, Europe. And everything that happens in the Middle East is affected by and affects what happens in Europe, and also, of course, affects the relationship between Israel and Europe. And Dr. Maya Sion Tzidkiyahu can explain this very well. She's the director of the program on Israel-Europe relations at the Mitvim Institute and co-president of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration. And of course, she's a professor in the Hebrew University about Europe and in the Tel Aviv University, and she is the best person to talk about that. So now the Zoom is yours, Maya. Thank you. Thank you, Roee. Good afternoon. I'd like to join what Elie Podeh said about the dream that's both good and bad about the relationship between Israel and the UAE. And actually, in the case of the EU, it's less dramatic. And I'm very proud to talk here as somebody who started to work at the Mitvim Institute and to contribute as much as I can to the relationship between Israel and the EU, which is a strategic partner to Israel. In the next 6 minutes, I'd like to talk about the relationship between Israel and the EU over this past year in the perspective of the past decade, which is, one could say, is a pretty lost decade in the political relations between Israel and the EU. Actually, this current year, 2020, led us to an all-time low of threats from the EU towards Israel in the context of the annexation program. But there's a big but here that the ending of this year can be one of the most optimistic year endings that we've had in the past decades. To conclude 2020 so far, the relationship between Israel and EU opened under the title of the century, the program of the century of President Trump, and then it went downhill to the threats from the EU if Netanyahu will realize his unilateral annexation program, and significantly improved under Ashkenazi as foreign minister. But at the same time, once we had the normalization accords with the Arab countries, it's trying to change the paradigm to find a solution to the conflict in the region, and it is forcing the EU to rethink the way to achieve its goal of a two-state solution. Let me start with the plan of the century of Trump. It was received by much criticism by the EU because it was outside the parameters that the EU has held for many years to solve the conflict. For example, negotiations based on the 67 border lines, exchange of territories between an independent democratic Palestinian state with territorial contiguity and Israel. And by the way, these are not just the parameters of the EU, but they are also specified in the UN resolutions from July 2014. The Trump plan talked about annexing 30% of the West Bank to Israel. And therefore, even if at the end what it was about is the establishment of a Palestinian state, it was far from the solution that the EU thought about in recent decades. Yet, the renewal of the relationships of the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians was perceived by the Europeans as a very good idea. But immediately after the century plan was advertised, the twist came in which Netanyahu declared that as part of his elections campaign, he declared the unilateral annexation. And the European Union responded very, very harshly against the annexation declarations of Netanyahu. Joseph Borrell, who is the highest representative of the foreign policy, security policy of the EU, as well as the foreign ministers and prime ministers of the major and most influential countries, Germany, France, Britain, Italy, Spain, and other countries in the EU, spoke against this. And not one country in the EU expressed any support for the annexation plan, not even Hungary. The response of the EU for the annexation plan was the harshest amongst all Western countries, even more than the response of some of the Arab countries. And it did include a very explicit hints that of measures that will be taken if Israel will realize the plan. Amongst other things, Foreign Minister Borrell said that if the annexation steps will be implemented, they will not go unresponded. And Borrell called Israel to avoid any unilateral measures. On May 15th, the Council of Foreign Ministers of the EU even reached a resolution to prepare reactive measures that will be taken against Israel if unilateral annexation will be implemented. Due to the internal split within the EU on the issue, they even considered options of bilateral measures out of a specific member states or a block of member states, and not on behalf of all 27. Because of this internal split, countries like Hungary and other countries were willing to impose a veto on declarations and measures against Israel. Then the bark of the EU will be worse than its bite, but still the significance of such measures could have been very harsh for certain sectors in Israel. It's important to understand that the EU is Israel's main commerce partner. More than 1/3 of Israel's export reaches the EU, and half of our import comes from it. So the EU has a very definite stick to threaten us with, and the EU was not about to use that heavy stick or bad, but it probably would have taken much lighter measures, but still with potential damage to Israel. And the main one would have been the non-renewal of the research agreement with an innovation agreement with Israel for 21 until 27. We're talking about a framework that is worth 9 billion euros. That is the second largest source in Israel for the funding of innovation and research. Once Netanyahu dropped the annexation program, as Gabriel differentiated himself, and he presented different positions than the prime ministers along the way, created an opening for a warming of their relations. Because they dislike Netanyahu so much, he received a very warm embrace and appreciation in Europe, Ashkenazi, in the foreign affairs ministry in Israel, Berlin and Brussels. They are trying to leverage the fact that Israel has dropped the annexation in order to convene the Council of Association. Let me explain what this council is. As part of the association agreement between Israel and the EU that was signed in 1995, which is the main agreement on which the functional and economic relations between us are based, there is one article that talks about the institutionalizing of a political dialogue at high levels, at the level of ministers. To this high-level forum is called the Council of Associations. This is intended to have conferences in which they will convene and examine the status of the relationship and how they can be promoted. The preparation of such a meeting will take months in order to get the maximum out of such a meeting. And the Association Council convened until 2012, but ever since 2012, it has been severed. The first visit of Ashkenazi as a foreign minister was Berlin. With the support of the German foreign minister Heiko Maas, Ashkenazi obtained the support of foreign minister Borrell to convene the Council of Associations. Hopefully, this will happen whilst Germany still serves as president. That means in the second half of this year, we have only 2 months left for that. And this is a window of opportunities for Israel, because after the German presidency, it will be transferred to Portugal and then to Slovenia and then to France. At this point, it's not clear yet if indeed the countries who opposed to it have stopped opposing. The emphasis is not just about the convening of the Council as a goal in and of itself, but as a means to promote the relationship between Israel and the EU, which have been seriously stuck in recent years, politically speaking, and an inability to promote the relationship and sign new agreements. And now I'd like to reach my last point, which are the normalization accords with the UAE and future agreements with Bahrain and Sudan, alongside talk about other Arab countries in this context. And these present a reality of a change of a paradigm. The fact that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not resolved is no longer an obstacle for normalization with Arab countries. And this change of paradigm requires that the EU must also reconsider things. If the EU wants to be an actor and not just serve as a wallet in the region, then the EU should consider lifting the linkage policy, that there's a link between no progress in the peace accords and to no progress in the relations in Israel, because so far this has not led to any achievement. The EU is depicted as a rival, a foe of Israel, and we've seen the results of a recent poll. And to encourage the anti-EU public opinion in Israel, which is unfounded and unjustified, we should treat them as Ashkenazi does and promote the relationship with this strategic partner of the State of Israel. We must base on relationship on dialogue, even if it is critical, and we need to know how to separate once again between politics and economics. Thank you very much, Mayan. Thank you very much, Maya. We will return to you later. But before we do that, let us turn our gaze to what can be found between Israel and the EU. That is the Mediterranean Basin, which has been a very active arena both for Israel and other countries, and Israel's policy is quite distinguished. A lot of things are happening there, and perhaps we should now turn to Gabi Mitchell, Director of External Relations at the Mitvim Institute, especially on energy aspects and other areas, and he can tell us a bit about what Israel has done there this past year, some success stories, some failures, plans for the future. Gabi, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Roee, and welcome everyone. The Eastern Mediterranean Basin is a region where the combination between the economic and strategic capabilities of the State of Israel has created an ocean of opportunities in this past decade. The discovery of natural gas in the sea in that region has created a new tool for Israel to maintain a dialogue with its neighbors, and obviously these ties will expand beyond the talks about pipes and export transactions. And I would like to focus on what has happened over this past year, several challenges that have occurred in the region, and at least some of the solutions, at least in my opinion, and the things that Israel will need to operate in this upcoming year. This past year, Israel has signed, along with Egypt, Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, Italy, Greece, and Cyprus, on a convention, a charter that officially anchors the position of the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum as an international organization that's devoted to energetic cooperation in the region. On top of that, Israel has signed an agreement with the governments of Cyprus and Greece on the export of gas through the Ismail pipe. And there's also an agreement with Greece and Cyprus against the spread of COVID-19 and maintaining the sky open in the upcoming period. After the explosion at the Beirut port, Israel has offered humanitarian and medical assistance to Lebanon, and Israel appointed an Israeli ambassador to Egypt, the first woman in this position, and also to improve the collaboration with Turkey and the collaboration with Egypt, Qatar, and other international actors in order to maintain the status quo and the flow to Gaza. There are three main challenges that Israel faces in the region. And also the identity cannot rely exclusively on the U.S. Israel must take care of its own strategic interests and to find additional ways to advance its goals. Another point, COVID-19, this plague, this pandemic that has conquered the world has impacted global gas prices, and now we are witnessing a collapse of gas prices and the freezing of the searches and also the development of gas searches in the region. We don't know when the numbers will resume to what they were before the pandemic and whether the impact of COVID-19 will bring together some of this regional gas. And a third issue, that's the main dilemma that the Eastern Mediterranean Basin countries are facing, including Israel, the policy of Turkey, which is challenging the regional order. Ankara is seeking to expand its influence through an independent and aggressive policy. Its approach stems from its willingness to challenge the success of the gas forum, which it is excluded from commercially. It must be a natural partner to the forum, but its relationship with Israel, Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus are too secure for it, are too tense for it to join. In the elections held recently in northern Cyprus, the candidate who won was supported by Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and this will almost certainly increase the tension between Cyprus and Greece. And by the way, this policy is challenging not just the gas forum, but also the US and the EU, and also the capabilities of the State of Israel to maintain its neutrality towards conflicts with its neighbors in the region. In the annual index of the Mitvim Institute, the Israeli majority believes that Israel should try and improve its relationship with Turkey, but this current situation does not enable that. I believe that these are processes that Israel can conduct in this upcoming year in order to promote its interests in the Mediterranean Basin. First of all, it must improve its relationship with its partners in the gas forum, for example, Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt, and to try to expand the collaborations in areas such as renewable energy, tourism, natural conservation, cybersecurity, and maritime security, and also to enhance its relationship with the European countries invested in the future of the region, first and foremost, France, Italy, Spain, and Germany. And the third element, to encourage the U.S. to be involved in the gas forum as an observer and to expand projects, research American-Israeli project for the participation of additional countries in order to diversify its collaborations and maximize the potential of the U.S.'s soft power to show a goodwill to resolve its maritime issue with Lebanon and to find an egalitarian solution for the energy crisis in the Gaza Strip, and ultimately to maintain an open communication channel with Turkey in order to ensure that possible escalation in the maritime region will not deteriorate to a point of no return and threaten it as well. Thank you very much, Gabi. Indeed, this is a region that we are following up on with great interest. So many things are happening there and are continuing to happen. And with your permission, I'd like to go back to you, Elie, and to ask you perhaps if you could comment on the American angle, how the new American administration, it's going to be a new administration this way or that way, how will that affect the evolution, the development of relationships in the Middle East? And following what you said, I'd like to hear whether the Arab Initiative has died along with the Abraham Accords. And also, if you could say something, did Israel properly detect the shifting of the weight, the shifting of the fulcrum from Egypt, Syria, and Iraq in the Arab world towards the heart of the Persian Gulf? And also to comment on the weakening of Jordan and how come its stability is so important to Israel. Okay, yes, I'll be glad to answer, so many answers. You don't have much time left, yes, because I have to start teaching at 5 o'clock, so I apologize, and I'd like to apologize to all the other participants. So let me address this briefly. First of all, I wanted to say one sentence. Gabi just talked about the Mediterranean, and what we've seen in this past year is quite amazing if we look at Israel's involvement and collaboration in the Mediterranean, but we always make the distinction between the Middle East and the Mediterranean, but it's very, very important to emphasize that these regions are now being kind of mixed together, and now you can see a lot of things that are relevant to both areas, and Israel finds itself no longer capable of making this separation, that there's a Mediterranean and a Middle East. We have these two regions that are now coming together, so we need to think how we or how Israel can act when one plane affects the other. As for your questions, as for the U.S., obviously Biden will be very different. He'll be very different. First of all, I believe that the Americans are on their way out and they're going to focus on the damages of COVID-19. That's one thing. And another point, the Palestinian issue will be very different. The Democratic American stance does not give approval for continued settlements, and it's definitely in favor of a two-state solution, and it would like to promote it in a way that's very different from Trump's approach. The question is, will they have the time and the mindset for that? And I believe no, at least not in the near future. This takes us to the next point. You asked me about the Arab Initiative. It's more or less dead. You cannot cling to something that was created 20 years ago in a completely different context with players that I won't say do not exist anymore, but they no longer play an important role. They are grappling with their own domestic issues. So the document exists. Okay, that's fine, but it should serve as a basis for something else. What is that something else? That's something that I think that the regional actors need to discuss. And this is why I'm connecting this to the US's, disengagement. If they're involved, that will be wonderful. But why not think in terms, for example, let's say the Israel and the Emiratis will think about it together. The Saudis, I think that the Saudis' greatest incentive to now enter a relationship with Israel, I'm talking about normalization, is if Israel will pay something in the Palestinian currency. We have here the foundation, the infrastructure. I believe this is a wonderful opportunity to promote something between Israel and the Saudis and to relate this to the Palestinian issue, because that will be a real win-win situation. And I don't think we've devoted enough attention to that. And the Saudis, are constantly talking about the importance of the Palestinian issue. Did we identify correctly or not? Often in Mitvim, we criticize Israel, and I think we justly do so. We criticize this government, we criticize Netanyahu, but it's important to say when the good things are happening. I think that these recent measures with the Gulf countries were very good and important, and they also have to do with certain things that are happening in the Gulf countries. Look at the relationship that have been evolved. There are people from the Mossad, from the foreign ministry going around Bahrain, and Olmert he met Bandar in 2006. Dagan was in Saudi Arabia in 2010. That's like 15 and 10 years ago. So this common interest, our shared interest vis-a-vis Iran, we've identified it, we've promoted it, but it all happened behind the scenes. And I think that what significantly changed that is the fact that the UAE dared take this action, take this measure, and that was an opening to something that we all didn't believe could happen. But there are vast opportunities here, and I think that after the elections, we have an opportunity to do new things that have not been done before, and we haven't talked about the Palestinians yet. Are they willing to be part of this game? That's a major question, but as a paradox, and I'll conclude with that, I think that even they understand that they cannot remain, behind and say no. And you have these voices talking about a peace summit. We want peace after the elections. We need to catch this and see what's the best instrument that will help us proceed. Is the society in Israel ready for that? I have to say that I'm skeptical about that, but we must go in that direction, and we would like to truly be part of the Middle East.
Thank you, Elie. Taking into account the potential that Elie is pointing at, and Moran, where can we take this potential? How can we tap it? And what joint challenges, perhaps, does Israel share with the United Emirates? What challenges are there to overcome in the relations in general? And I'd be very happy if you could relate to the Palestinian issue that Elie ended with. How can the Palestinian issue challenge or assist in the relations between Israel and the United Emirates? Perhaps their relations with the Emirates can assist in resolving the relations with the Palestinians. I would be very happy to hear your take on it, and the floor is yours. So thank you. If I am to enumerate and look at the potential of the relations, I won't finish very quickly. I think it's easier and more apt to talk about the challenges and the barriers. We identified a number of challenges, even Temple Mount, for example. Another example is not meeting political, commitments, annexation or not, as well as others later on, security checkups in the Ben Gurion airport, Israelis that perhaps find themselves arrested because of committing certain felonies. These are things that might happen, and you will have to rise to every such challenge later on, and we should, hit them already now and prepare a strategy that would map those challenges in order to see how we grapple with them later. And the main barriers, I pointed at some of them, but still there are factors. Some of them belong to the Emirates and others do not belong to the Emirates. We're not all too enthusiastic about this relationship. Some of these appear in the press, in places that have a lot of clout and impact on public opinion. We have to take this into heart, and even the academia. Some of those elements opened up as soon as this statement was made, and others hesitate and are afraid to go in our direction. We know this a bit more. We all live in the same world, and I also pointed at the local leaders whose expressions we haven't heard yet. So these are those barriers that we will need to grapple with. With respect to the Palestinian issue, something important that I haven't related to yet. As you know, there's a well-known anger toward the Palestinian leadership. There's a very clear division between the Palestinian society and the Palestinian leadership in the eyes of the Emirates. There's an attempt to describe it as the extreme radical element in the Middle East along these axes of, painted by the United Emirates and other countries, and according to it, actually delineate the axes in the Middle East. Qatar joining Hamas also serves this narrative about those forces, and from what I understand, and what I hear from the United Emirates, the country is not antagonistic to the Palestinians, not at all. If I only take as an anecdote what Khamtour said, one of the most influential business people said, he said, it suffices us to have a finger pointed at us by the Palestinians, we'll extend our entire hand toward them. They want to be extremely active in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. It's important for it to show its solidarity with the Palestinians. They would very much want to serve as mediators like Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar are doing this in order to serve its cause of becoming a very influential country in the region. But at the moment, we're talking about a very feeble relationship between the countries. The United Emirates are trying to undermine the legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership in order to weaken it. Once the leadership changes, perhaps it would realize its aspiration to enter this area and help us resolve the conflict. Thank you, Moran. Maya, you ended, or you mentioned in your words that Gabi Ashkenazi has attempted to change the Israeli discourse vis-a-vis the EU. Why is it at all important for Israel to strengthen its relations with the EU? Perhaps we'd rather have a weak European Union that won't be able to criticize Israel's policy in the territories. What advantage would Israel have in having a very powerful European Union? Why is the agreement important at all? And if you manage to relate to that too, that would be good. To what extent the COVID crisis can bring Israel and the EU closer to one another, if at all it's important? That's a good question. And it's not easy to answer it in the context of whether Israel wants a strong or a weak European Union, because the EU is a partner to the state of Israel, and we have to define it as such, even if it is a critical partner to the state of Israel, and it has criticism leveled at Israel concerning its conduct in the territories. Still, scientifically, commercially, with respect to higher education, culture, and various other vast areas, be it agriculture or economy or whatever we do, we are tightly related to the to the EU. Until the recent normalization process, Europe is its hinterland. It's the main area that it relates to. So for us Israelis, we want to have a stronger European Union. Even if it is critical, it is among like-minded countries that are democratic, and the EU conducts itself according to the very same principles that the State of Israel was founded on, and I do hope it will continue to conduct itself according to. So definitely we should not aspire to have a weak European Union. And I do hope that the very turbid political relations would be replaced by better relationship, and also that the public in Israel would be gradually more exposed to the economic relations that underlie the relationship. Very often these are between individuals. You have a very, very good social fabric between the Israelis and European countries. So we should not allow politics to actually stain the relations that exist between Israel and the EU. Concerning the association agreement, this is one of a network of agreements, of association agreements that the EU signs with the neighboring countries, from Morocco all through Tunisia and other countries, Egypt and Jordan, who are neighbors, the Palestinians who have an intermediate agreement, and all the way to the north. And Europe has those association agreements, which are the most fundamental agreements upon which the relations are based. And from this, you can develop many things. Even though this agreement is extremely old, it's from 1995, it was not exhausted yet. There are provisions concerning the service sector that was not exhausted in the relations between Israel and the EU. So there's still a lot to develop, but I would point our attention toward the fact that neighboring countries are already developing the next generation of agreements, partnership priorities, or the free trade area, and an agreement from 1995 when the global economy is going through so many transformations and digitization and otherwise, our economy is no longer what it was 35 years ago. So definitely we should base our relations on a new agreement, that we should upgrade our relations, and the better the linkage that the EU is stipulating, that unless Israel proceeds with Palestinians, the EU would not upgrade its relations with Israel. We have to work really hard in order to remove this linkage, which actually does not lead us anywhere, creates in the EU a bad image to the Israelis, and actually spoils the good relations that do exist between these countries. Concerning COVID, we need to wait and see. Definitely there are collaborations. Israel has been proven, despite the chaos that we look at through Israeli eyes, Israel lags behind us in the second wave. It continues to develop in many countries in Europe. They too feel that they're losing control over this second wave that is exceeding the first one with respect to the percentage of the contagious element of the disease. And of course, things could be better, but we see scientific studies that are developing. There are cooperation agreements that give Israeli companies millions of euros to develop various means to contend with COVID, whether it's vaccinations or others. So that's a very fertile ground for collaboration between Israel and the EU. It's true that in the first wave, they looked at us more positively, and we now have to get to the second wave, and we're already in the midst of it. Perhaps we cannot talk about it in very positive terms, but perhaps Israel will become a certain light unto the nations. Perhaps it's hard for us, the Israelis, to understand it, but Europe has its own chaos. We have a lot to learn from Europe, and Europe has a lot to learn from Israel, and this collaboration can only be beneficial to both parties. Thank you, Maya. If we leave Europe and go to a different direction, Europe grew from the coal and the steel agreement. Gabi, you mentioned the regional gas agreement and its institutionalization. Can it turn into a major tool in institutionalizing regional collaboration in the Mediterranean basin? I'd be very interested to hear what you think. And also you mentioned the importance of maintaining open relations with Turkey. I'd be very happy if you could explain why. And in addition to this, if we already talk about COVID that lowers gas prices, and the gas was in the very foundation of the consolidation of this region, what should Israel do in order to keep and maintain the system of alliances that it has?
תודה רועי, וקודם כל אני רוצה לוודא שכולם שומעים אותי טוב, כי כנראה הפעם הקודמת שמעו אותי גם בעברית וגם באנגלית, אבל לא האנגלית שלי.
בינתיים בסדר.
בסדר. אז קודם כל לגבי פורום הגז, אנחנו יודעים שהפורום כרגע הוא פורום שבבסיס של הפורום הוא שיתוף פעולה בין משרדי אנרגיה של ישראל וכל השותפים האחרים. בנוסף לכך יש שיתוף פעולה של חברות הגז שפועלות באזור, שכמובן הן חברות שקיימות מכל מיני מדינות בעולם, כולל עכשיו חברת שברון מארצות הברית, ואני רואה שעכשיו אנשים אומרים שהם שומעים אותי בשתי השפות, אז איזה שפה עדיף שאני אדבר?
דבר באנגלית, קצר, 2 דקות.
Okay. The primary responsibility of the gas forum is to enhance cooperation in the field of energy. Right now, those responsibilities are held by the ministries of energy in all of the representative countries. So it's not realistic, at least in the coming year, to see the gas forum to expand its responsibilities, but I did highlight it as one of the things that Israel should be advocating for, because the exploitation of energy has tremendous ramifications, both in economics, environmental protection, and elsewhere. So there's opportunity for the gas forum to expand its purpose and its mission, and in particular during a period in which it's unclear as to whether the region's gas is going to be exported to far-off markets in Asia or in Europe in the near future. This could be a way for the forum to remain relevant, to expand its mission, to include perhaps regional opportunities for cooperation in tourism, maritime protection, renewable energy, etc. Very briefly about Turkey, because I know we are running out of time. You cannot understand or appreciate the nuances of geopolitics in the Eastern Mediterranean without Turkey. Turkey is an essential part of the region. It is one of the largest markets, not only for natural gas, but one of the largest markets. And it's an economy right now that's on the brink of disaster. Yet despite all of those things, and despite its aggressive policies in the region, when you build a strategic policy, you need to be thinking not only about the present, but about the future. And Turkey's future will remain in the Eastern Mediterranean, no matter what the other countries in the region would like to do.
Thank you, Gabi, and I apologize for the problems with the interpreting and the languages. And I do want to thank Elie and Maya and Moran and Gabi for their presentations. They gave us just a taste of what happened in the various areas that Israel belongs to. And the pictures, you must have noticed, is a lot more complex and full of, tiny nuances and stipulations and reservations. It's all too complicated to be able to just, give a comprehensive view of it in just one session. I do hope that we manage to present you with the main insights, and that you leave this session with a lot more knowledge concerning Israel's policy in the region and a better ability to criticize Israel's policy in these regions, and also many more questions and a wish to learn more and to follow up on Gabi, Maya, and Moran and the other researchers of the Mitvim Institute and what they do. We saw that Israel's foreign policy keeps changing all the time. There are many developments and many challenges and good opportunities that Israel can seize. And Israel is very, very far from the image of being an island, an image that it held on to for many years. Perhaps we're no longer a villa in the jungle. Perhaps we too are a jungle, but we're not a tiny country surrounded by enemies. Israel discovers that it can gain and benefit from collaborations, that it can have relations with countries that sometimes have disagreements among themselves, that it can play in different, courts in parallel, and to put its eggs in a number of baskets and to conduct its business with a lot of sensitivity. And perhaps circumstances forced Israel to adopt this approach, not some informed decision. Israel can gain greatly if it can perfect its policy, foreign policy, if it can match its tools, and if it manages to set up a foreign policy system that would serve as a very major part of the Israeli decision-making processes. And that brings us to close the current session and to move on to the next speaker. So once again, I'd like to thank all the speakers, but the segue would allow us to expand the discourse against the backdrop of the developments that we have now described, and to hear a political perspective that would also relate to the Israeli foreign policy. Our next speaker, and I'm very, very happy and excited and honored to introduce, is member of Knesset Ofer Shelah from Yesh Atid-Telem party. Before he was a member of Knesset, he was very active in the media, in a number of media outlets. As member of Knesset, he served in previous Knessets as the chairperson of Yesh Atid, member of the Foreign Policy and Security Committee, even presented a draft bill on the topic, and did many other important things. But I want him to talk, not for me to introduce him. Today he's the chairperson of the State Controller's Committee, and his experience in the and the positions that he served in, and his analytical capabilities creates a lot of interest in us to hear about the functioning of the foreign ministry and how and if the erosion in the Israeli democracy and the corruption that is all too prevalent impacts the relations between the State of Israel and other countries and its standing in the world. So, MK Ofer Shelah, the floor is yours, and I thank you for your willingness to be here with us. Thank you very much. After such an introduction, I can only leave at the peak. Thank you very much. It was very pleasant. You linked together in this introduction a number of things, and I will try to relate to them all, but I will start with the political issue and the specific change it underwent in the last few months. My personal view has been, and I've been talking about this since 2014 after Operation Defensive Shield, that actually the major change that took place in the Middle East as of 2011, the beginning of what they called back then the Arab Spring, created a situation, and here I talk to people who are interested in this subject, so I can use bullets to explain what I mean. It's pretty clear. The very open schism in the very heart of the Middle East today lies between what I call the states that seek stability. They're not necessarily moderate, definitely not democratic, but they seek stability, and the radical Islam with its two arms, the Shiite led by Iran and the Sunni led by ISIS until not too long ago, but you will have other symbols soon enough. And this fact created an opportunity for the State of Israel in order to do two things that are interrelated. And here, of course, I get to the very core of the political debate in Israel. One, there's no argument about the fact that we need to strengthen the status of the State of Israel in the region. You have to remember that the fact that we have not been partners to any regional process, perhaps since the attempt of Ben-Gurion to have the Alliance of Peripheries in the 1950s, created a situation in which many, many important things that took place not only in the Middle East, but in our neighborhood. For example, the situation in Syria, for example, the Iranian nuclear issue, were determined ultimately, or will be determined one way or another, without having the Israeli interest represented around the table, or worse than that, without the Israeli joint interest to those elements that seek stability in the region, that gain strength because of that schism in the Middle East, because of that threat that the radical Islam poses to the entire region, would not be present on the table. A very clear example is Syria. It is a country that borders Israel. We have a very strong interest in it. We are not invested in it, but other elements in the Middle East. But when Russia organizes, and I said this quite often, that when Putin invites Netanyahu to take pictures in the Red Square, but when he sits to organize Syria after the civil war, he has Rouhani on the one side and Erdogan on the other. These are two personas that have great hostility toward us because they are players and we're not a player. And why? Because something else happened in the Middle East in the past 8 years, or perhaps more, perhaps 12 years, and I think that it is not changing now. Despite the recent agreements, despite the very deep involvement of the Trump administration and the push he gave to these recent agreements. And the fact is that the U.S. is leaving the Middle East. In the conclusion of Obama's foreign policy, whose most significant expression was a large article in The Atlantic of Jeffrey Goldberg, it was an interview with Obama, as a matter of fact, in the third person. Obama related to the Middle East as a region to be avoided, and Trump, to a large extent, related to it in a similar way in his concept of America first. And this created a situation that what I thought should happen, and I once called it in an article that I wrote, the real century deal, and that is to offer to the state, to the United States, a Middle East that would be led by the allies, first and foremost Israel, but other countries that seek stability, the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Jordan, Egypt, and so on and so forth. That would bring the US back to the Middle East. And then the situation would be such that there won't be any diplomatic move vis-a-vis Iran without having the Israeli interest on the table. There won't be any regulation or any agreement achieved. By the way, the Russians asked us to open a window for them in Washington in return for our participation in the negotiations over Syria. What has changed in the last few months? Benjamin Netanyahu tried to lead a certain concept, and to a certain extent is now celebrating perhaps his victory in that sense, which said, yes, we can improve and fixate our standing here in the region without using the Palestinian chip. Here, the Palestinian cause is not really of any interest to the Arab world. The Palestinians have lost their veto right with respect to Israel's participation in a regional process, and here it is. It's happening right in front of our eyes. Benjamin Netanyahu and myself have disagreements between us. I think that parting with the Palestinians is a major interest of the State of Israel if it wishes to stay Jewish and democratic, and I see this as a win-win situation, that we, together with these countries, would actually fixate the status of the State of Israel in the region, and together with them, we would ignite the process of parting with the Palestinians that has been stuck for many years. One process is positive no matter how you look at it. The Palestinians indeed pay a price for the first time concerning their refusal. And I don't want to go into the analysis who's more of a stubborn refuser and who's less. This is a historic matter that I don't wish to enter right now. It has a great importance, but it's not a part of our subject right now. I believe the momentum of this process, we will not exhaust, definitely not with respect to separating with the Palestinians, and if we don't, it will remain as a topical conjecture, some sort of a deal that is struck for the benefit of improving the situation of certain regimes in the Middle East who are afraid that in a week from now, Trump would no longer be president and they will have lost their chance to have a deal with the US, not with Israel. So I think we should take advantage of this momentum in order to get a certain regional process moving, in the framework of which the negotiations with the Palestinians would renew, and there would be a true shaping of the Middle East, and not just topical agreements of different natures that are all very positive in and of itself. That, and when we look at the situation more generally, the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, regretfully, I see no change. I saw this when I looked at the materials that you sent me. In that sense, I'm a part of the public at large. I do not see any difference in the status of the Foreign Ministry. I see a process that started a long time ago, and Netanyahu has accelerated in his government of 2015 when they took the Foreign Ministry and divided its powers for political reasons to I don't know how many parts, and that's the way it still remains. And the Ministry for Strategic Affairs deals with a certain type of political advocacy that has to do with the BDS, and in the Ministry of Diaspora they do something else, and so on and so forth. That, in my view, is a very substantial mistake. The Foreign Ministry, because of its foot on the ground, boots on the ground, and because of the fact that these matters are interwoven and they must be embedded in the very same center of knowledge and action. Everything had to pass through the Foreign Ministry, but it won't happen with Benjamin Netanyahu because of political reasons. This is why we first did this in the 19th Knesset, a member of Knesset, Ronen Hoffman, and myself, and then I took it when he left the Knesset, and I submitted the bill to stabilize the Foreign Ministry and its network. But when you submit such a thing, everyone knows you don't need a law for that, and if you don't want it, no bill would ever help you gain that. But it has to be there, and I believe that it makes really a major damage to Israel when we don't have it. And the last thing I'd like to say is the following. Not only is it technically impossible for the foreign ministry to be there, that was even the case before Netanyahu. Traditionally, the ministers of foreign affairs were eager to be ministers of foreign affairs, not the heads of the foreign ministry. They never bothered to nurture their ministries. I don't know if you know them, but I'm sure many people know the very dire situation of our missions abroad, the very dire situation of the foreign system in many other aspects. I tried to help their unions people when they went on strike and to mediate between them and the foreign ministers. But that creates a situation in which we do not see any coordinated, integrated action of one system that is backed up by the vital interests of the State of Israel. And I'll say, by way of an ending, what I believe is an interest of the highest order for the State of Israel and can become even more problematic as of next week. The tear between us and the US Jewry, this divide, this schism, I don't know if it started in a premeditated way. Today, it's not that the Prime Minister wants it to be, but the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, almost says it with his own words, sees the US Jewry as an element that would be eliminated from the map. Most of them would be assimilated. Most of them would lose their ties to the State of Israel. On the one hand of the political map that looks the way it is. I'm sorry, but we get disconnects here. We can't hear the speaker. And how it is connected to a growing minority as a Hispanic and so forth. But this thing that is obviously related to the intra-political situation in the US and can be expressed if the Democrats win the elections, and there's a chance that not only Biden would win, but that there would be a Democratic sweep, and that the two houses, one is already Democratic, for the other one to be Democratic as well. I assume all those who are here, or most of you know as well as I do, the various currents which are almost at the center of the map. Maybe it's not Biden, but it's almost at the center of the map. It came into expression when the issue of annexation was on the agenda. I had Zoom talks with various elements, including various factors in the Democratic Party who talked, and not Ocasio-Cortez, but other elements who were more centrist in their affiliation, who openly spoke about linking the aid money to the annexation issue. This issue, contending with it, and first and foremost, the real linkage between that, destiny tie and the identification between Israel and the Jewish community in the US, this is something that needs to be done, to do it in a very consolidated way with one policy, and no one is fitter than the foreign ministry to do that. And I link it all because our ability to operate and influence the US is also tightly connected to the topics which have to do with our immediate vicinity. One is dependent on the other. Thank you, Ofer.
Once again, I'd like to thank you for your time. I was happy to help. We definitely share with you this desire to help and reinforce the Israeli foreign system. Thank you very much. Ofer did mention the Ministry for Strategic Affairs, for strategic matters. And the person who will be joining us now to talk about this is the Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ms. Orit Farkash Hacohen, who comes from a background. She was a lawyer. She was the head of the Electricity Authority in the turbulent times of establishing the gas outline. She entered the Knesset in 2019 as some of the achievements of Blue and White, and she took an active part in a research and policy group that focuses on Israel's policy in the Mediterranean Basin. So following what we just heard from Ofer Shelah, we'd like to hear from her how she views, how she considers her role, the role of the ministry, what are the challenges, the main challenges Israel faces in this field, and which opportunities lie in the political changes that have occurred in the region. So now I give the floor to you, Orit, please. Dr. Goren, the chair of Mitvim Institute, Dr. Pasch, the chairman of the foundation. As I started out my position, I realized that we need to place an emphasis on the war on the hearts and minds that is taking place in the social media networks, which is happening day in, day out in Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and others. It is not only a struggle over an image, but on the truth, on people's mindset, on the good name, the reputation of Israel. Israel has had to deal with a very complex delegitimization campaign, which is funded and led by organizations, NGOs, and institutions, some of them with close ties to terror organizations and others don't. These organizations are acting in several arenas, but the main arena that I have decided to focus on is that of the mindset, of people's minds, the manipulation of people's minds, establishing this false appearance of a social discourse against Israel in the social media networks in an attempt to impact the public agenda in a way that negates the existence of the state of Israel and its interests as a legitimate state. Social media networks do not enforce from their side properly their usage policy, and that's how we reached a situation in which this arena of the digital world with these social media networks have become paradise of incitement against Israel and fake news. And following this understanding, immediately as I assumed position, I decided to take action in two areas. First of all, to advance a broad and extensive discourse with new groups, with new people in order to enhance Israel's legitimacy and also to establish tools and initiatives in the ministry that will strengthen Israel at the level of awareness against the incitement in the social media networks. This is the action I took regarding the social media networks usage policy. The existing one is insufficient. It isn't being enforced, and there's no transparency on how they deal complaints on this matter. For example, Twitter allowed Khamenei, the leader of Iran, to come up with a storm of tweets in which he speaks about Israel in anti-Semitic terms, calling the Jewish state a cancer that must be uprooted. I mean, if any other individual, private person would have written that, it would have been expunged because this is incitement and anti-Semitism. But according to Twitter, what a private person cannot do, a leader of a country can do. And if somebody would say that, okay, we're against censorship, you would agree with me that it should have at least been somehow labeled or marked. For example, tweets by other people or organizations in the US are labeled and are expunged. And this topic, my ministry, my office has been engaged in a dialogue and in a roundtable with all the social media networks in recent months, and hopefully we will reach good results. As for the hate talk in the internet, we're trying to exercise other tools. Just this past week, I inaugurated a new media center with the mayor of Julis and the director of national service. And as of this year, 6 young women from the Druze community will operate a digital media room in the Arabic language in which they will talk about their own truth, what they think about the state of Israel in the internet and in the social media networks, and they'll do so in Arabic. I think that this venture has tremendous significance for the state of Israel. This is an initiative that has tremendous potential, and it will connect the women from the Druze community and not just the men of that community further to the state of Israel. The importance of this initiative became even clearer to me recently when my office exposed a well-funded, well-timed campaign in the social media network that was initiated by Hamas and Hezbollah in Arabic against the Emirate countries. Following the normalization agreements with them, these organizations led a campaign calling them traitors. Ladies and gentlemen, the state of Israel is dealing with major challenges, but it also has opportunities as a government, as a minister in the government. Only recently I voted in favor of an agreement that was signed with the UAE, and there are other accords with Bahrain, Sudan, and other countries. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, Sudan had hosted the infamous Khartoum summit in which the Arab countries spoke against Israel and said no to recognition, no to peace, and no to normalization. Today, we are witnessing the opposite trend, the trend of recognition. They're now saying yes to dialogue, yes to connections, and no to boycotts. And in this context, I'd like to finish with a few words in my other capacity as Israel's Minister of tourism. Tourism between countries is the best expression of peace between nations. And it is for a specific reason why Menachem Begin emphasized the importance of tourism as building bridges to peace in his reply address to the Knesset when Saddam visited Israel. The peace accords are signed by governments, but true peace is built by people, by individuals who meet each other. We in Israel expect tourists from Arab countries, from Muslim countries. This will instill true peace content into these accords between the nations and will continue to enhance Israel's legitimacy and position and status in the region and in the world. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. And we hereby finish the first session. Now I'm honored to pass the mic to Dr. Nimrod Goren, the head of the Mitvim Institute, who will moderate the next session, which will deal with Israeli diplomacy in Muslim and Arab states. The floor is now yours, Nimrod. Thank you, Roee. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the fourth annual conference of the Institute. Thank you to the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation and our wonderful team at Mitvim. And the second session will take everything you've heard so far and will continue to further develop it. We'll talk about Israeli policy, Israeli diplomacy with respect to Muslim and Arab states. You know, in recent years, new opportunities have been created. Relationships with the Arab countries that have been changing and new cooperations. And we're not just talking about covert and security ties as we've been accustomed to see in the past. We have more and more relationships that are out in the open with civilian aspects, and the decision makers and the public in Israel have all identified this. And you see a change in how they treat the Middle East. You see that they are treating the Middle East more and more as an arena in which they can collaborate and not just with the need to defend ourselves against the realization of the relationship with the Arab countries. They are showing they are harbingers of progress in the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. We've heard how much has changed, but we can see that in these countries that we've signed accords with, the Palestinian issue is still there. And if we want to exhaust the full opportunities, we need to make some progress there. But there are other elements that are delaying the realization of the potential. Some of them can be found here in Israel, and we're going to talk about them in this session on how we manage the relations with the Arab countries by the various elements in the government. And the state controller actually published an extensive report about the Israeli foreign policy system. It identified 35 government elements that all operate in this field of foreign policy without any coordination, without any integrating organization, whilst the foreign ministry, which is supposed to be responsible for all that, has been significantly weakened in recent years. We see this expressed in how we manage ties with countries, and even examples of that have been seen over the past 2 months since the normalization with the UAE has been declared. And this is manifesting the tension between the security echelon and the civilian and the foreign affairs echelon, and sometimes even in areas where the foreign ministry used to be very active and very influential, and still it is other government agencies which receive the credit. It can be found in rivalry and lack of collaboration between different government offices that sometimes operate in the same places with the same people, sometimes for the same goals, and sometimes, you know, one doesn't know about the other. This is also manifest in lack of sufficient supervision, lack of sufficient parliamentary oversight by the Knesset, the Foreign Affairs and Security Ministry, as well as other parliamentary entities that have no oversight on what the government is doing in these areas. And it is also manifest in the need for a greater interface between official elements and non-official elements, and their role in modern diplomacy is growing. In a period in which Israel is facing new opportunities and new ties in the region, we must have much greater synergy between all these elements mentioned earlier, and to reduce the rivalry between them. And we must ensure that the new ties being fostered with the regional countries are handled by the best hands. And usually these hands can be found in the ministry, the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And also we must re-examine how the Israeli government is is addressing the ties with regional countries. And this is what we're going to deal with in this upcoming sessions with the help of speakers coming from the academia, the foreign ministry, the press and research institutes. We will try to examine what are the phenomena and recently, and also if we look back into history, because this is the eve of the memorial date for the assassinated Prime Minister Rabin. We must remember what happened back in the times of Oslo. It didn't start just now with Netanyahu. We started developing relations with countries in the region back then over 20 years ago. We have 4 speakers in this session, and I will introduce each as I approach them. The first one, Dr. Ehud Elran is a board member at the Mitvim Institute at the Haifa University and is currently a visiting scholar at Stanford University. He was formerly an advisor to Prime Minister Barak. Udi, we're going to speak with you first because we would like to establish some kind of a historic context and how Israeli policy developed in this region, who led it over the years, how it evolved over the years, and how do you see this continuing into the future? Thank you very much for inviting me in Nimrod, and congratulations for all of the achievements of the Institute in a challenging environment this year. Well, the image currently, as you've said, is that there are various elements involved in the relationship with Arab countries, with an emphasis of the various security agencies. There were reports of the visits of the head of the Mossad, and it seems as if the foreign ministry isn't receiving its appropriate position. And as we look at things in a historic perspective, this was not the case when Israel started out on this path. The political effort vis-a-vis the Arab countries was during the pre-state Israel was handled by the political department of the Jewish agency, and after the establishment of the state of Israel, it was the foreign ministry that led that. Maybe some of you remember there were contacts with King Abdallah, the Jordanian emir, and even with the Egyptian prime minister during the 48 War of Independence. All of them were handled by the diplomatic or political department of the Jewish agency and then by the foreign ministry. And if we fast forward, it seems that most of the activities recently are motivated by security reasons. And why has this gap been created? I think that some of these matters simply are not reported, or people don't sufficiently remember them. We remember the 1990s. Perhaps even before that, you know, with the peace with Jordan and Egypt, once again brought the foreign ministry into these matters. As I prepared for this, I found that some of the people who were involved in these matters in the 1940s continue to support that. Even after their retirement, they continue to be involved in the dialogue with Arab countries. Eliyahu Sasson, for example, who, it was written about him in the early 70s. There were Egypt and Jordan where embassies were established. And of course, the breakthrough following Oslo, when the missions were opened up in Tunisia, Mauritania, Oman, Qatar, and a few other countries, the foreign affairs missions opened them. And there's some covert activity and according to media reports, a type of a secret embassy in Bahrain since 2009. I'd like to say a few words about why it was transferred from something that was under the dominance of the foreign ministry or the organization that was a precursor, and that included various covert activities. This was all handled by the foreign ministry. Until the establishment of the Mossad in 1951, it was the foreign ministry that led covert activities overseas. It is affected by several things. First of all, we're talking about the type of interaction, which included diplomatic measures, the attempt to prevent the outbreak of the War of Independence. At least in the first 30 years, most of the interaction was about security measures. Perhaps the symbolic point is the armistice discussions after 48. And for example, Yitzhak Rabin, who was 26, they came to the Rhodes discussions and participated in the diplomatic dialogue, Yadin, Harkabi, people from the military, and other elements of activities vis-a-vis the Arab countries. For example, taking out Jews out of Northern Africa in the 1950s, that was done covertly, and this is why it was handled by the Mossad. A second point we need to think about, which is also relevant relevant for today. And perhaps the significance of the type of interaction means that the more we switch from less security-oriented interaction, this will open up space for non-defense elements. There was an expectation that peace with Egypt and Jordan, it will lead to dialogue between the civil societies. That didn't happen. There's an initial impression that it will happen with these new normalization accords, and this will bring in non-security-oriented elements. There are various practical elements that have to do with the policy with these countries. Another issue, this area before the War of Independence was open, and people like Elie, who was head of the political department and the first ambassador to the US, he studied for his BA studies in the Beirut American University, people who became very senior in the Arab world. Elie Sasson, who was in charge of many of the contacts with the Egyptians, he was born in Damascus, and he sent his wife to Damascus so that their son Moshe Sasson, who was later on appointed as ambassador to Egypt, was there. And these are people who lived in an open region, and they knew personally the Arab world. And as these new accords will enable these contexts, this will create a greater cadre of people who are not necessarily from the security field and who will be involved in these relationships. And back then, and to a certain extent today, diplomacy in the Middle East is important, but it's less important in comparison to diplomacy with the superpowers. We saw the importance of the US even in obtaining recent accords, especially the one with Sudan. And the significance is, as the Americans pull out of the region and the more we see the entrance of other superpowers into the region, we will need diplomats who will be involved in this field and not just people from the security establishment. And much of our diplomacy with the Arab world is done by the US, or rather it is American incentives that motivate this. In various other areas, we see the Americans pulling back, and a void will open up. And as we talked about the void that's opening up in the Eastern Mediterranean, and as the Turks enter this open space, will continue in our region as well as the Americans pull out. There will be more room for more significant Israeli diplomacy in managing this region. Another point is that many of the achievements in the past 20 years were achieved in multilateral rounds. The first mission in Dubai in 2005 was part of the UN Renewable Energy Organization. That kind of went beneath the radar, but Israel became for the first time one of the agencies that established a regional organization, the Gas Forum in Cairo. We can imagine other regional fora that Israel will take part in. And the multilateral space, because of the Israeli structure, is mainly diplomatic. So I have no doubt that there will be need for a greater involvement of the foreign ministry. There are other structural questions. Foreign ministries, not just in Israel, like Ofer, Shelah mentioned, and as you said, are being challenged. If I'll use the Silicon Valley jargon, they're being disrupted because of technology, which makes it much easier to establish direct relations between individuals and not necessarily between foreign ministries, and also because of the type of governance we see both in Israel and in other countries in which the leadership, what is called, a team diplomat, whether it's the president in the US, here in Israel, it's the prime minister. They are constantly involved in some significant aspects of diplomacy. And here as well, it depends on this international global trend. We've seen a renewed enhancement of the nation state and the nation state mechanisms. So the agency involved in the nation state in foreign policy, structurally, there is a chance that they will be further strengthened, especially as most countries around us, the state mechanism is still very strong there in the relationship with the US or Western European countries. These are open societies. There are a lot of dialogues there between academics and business people, but in a region in which the state is still strong, and that is the situation in most countries around us, there will be a need for state involvement. And my last point, which is a broad point regarding Israeli diplomacy, and it has to do with something I said earlier. We relied in many areas on the central location of the US and its importance in multilateral organizations, for for example, its veto in the UN, but the more the US continues in their path of America first, and as it distances itself from international mechanisms, we've seen how the US has pulled out of several organizations under Trump, but I believe that perhaps with Biden as well, we can also see that, and the more we see that, we will need more creative diplomacy professionals who will be able to navigate Israel, in which we are parting from one superpower and another superpower will rise to power. It was very convenient for us to lean on the Americans, but perhaps this era has come to an end. So these were some very brief opening comments. Thank you. Thank you, Udi. That created a very good basis for our discussion in this session. The next speaker is Haim Regev, Deputy Director General for Middle East in the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who works very closely with the Foreign Minister Gavi Ashkenazi, and he can share with us his view, the ministry's view regarding the role of the Foreign Ministry in establishing ties recently with the Gulf countries and the role of the Foreign Ministry in designing the foreign relationship between Israel and Arab countries. Hi, everyone. First of all, I've been in this business. I've served as Deputy Director General for Middle East in the past 5 years, and before that, I was involved in the Gulf countries. I'll talk about that later, but I cannot ignore what Knesset member Shelah said. I think everything that he said and everything others have said about the status, the position of the Foreign Ministry is true for 6 months ago. Today, we have a Foreign Minister who's working full-time, and he is really placing the ministry at a completely different place, whether we're talking about budgets and involvement. And I'm not going to get into all the details of where it is found in the peace accords, the Abraham Accords. I see here 3 former ambassadors, Dani Carmon, Baruch Bina, and many others who can tell you from their experience. I don't wish to get into this argument. It's not that I think. I can tell you that it's in a very different position now, the foreign ministry, since we've had a full-time minister with some true political clout. But I'm a professional, so I'm not going to get into all that. I would like to say that ultimately, and I can describe what the ministry has done in recent years, we need to see not just what's happening inside Israel, but we should see what's happening in other places. Ultimately, when you wish to examine who are the people in the region, in the Arab countries that ties have been formed with in recent years, ultimately, it's not foreign ministries, it's the ruler, various security entities, and quite naturally, their partners, whether it's the Mossad or other agencies who are involved in intel and security affairs. So ultimately, to a great extent, this reflects the interest of our interlocutors or counterparts. The foreign ministry is perceived by the region, by the Arab world, as the last frontier before normalization. Once you reach the foreign ministry, it means we're truly heading towards full accords. We're not a covert organization. And this is why there were some apprehensions. And despite that, I would like to say that since the 1990s, we've had a dominant and continuous presence in all Gulf countries. When I say presence, not necessarily physical presence, but some kind of context with all elements in the region. It's been my privilege and the honor to open Israel's mission in Oman 2 years ago. I was there for 2 years between 96 to 98, and then during this millennium in the different missions were shut down, and we were only left with the peace country since 2009. And yet throughout these years, the ties with the Gulf countries were maintained. Every country had this different package, and in every country we created a specific type of ties that are typical of that country. And I think that the greatest achievement of the foreign ministry, maybe we're not at the forefront, and we've heard this, is the normalization. What's the normalization? Because I have traveled to many countries in the region within my capacity, within my job, and It's become normalized, or customized. They've become customized to us coming there. The mission in Abu Dhabi since 2016, I opened that mission, Israel's mission there. And since 2016, we've had a regular mission of Israel in Abu Dhabi. It was about renewable energies, and that meant I always traveled there under my passport, under my name, not with a foreign passport, but with the passport of an Israeli diplomat and my capacity as Deputy Director General of the Middle East. And that's how I traveled there. And the first time I got there 7 or 8 years ago, I'm talking about these places, for example, in the UAE, it took them about 2 hours to let me in. They placed me in a VIP lounge. That was at the beginning. But last time, the very last few visits there, it only took like 5 minutes and I came with my passport. And I think that this is one of the most important things of the Middle East, and that maybe the foreign ministry did, and not everybody knows about that, because when we were there, we spoke with non-intel elements, civilian elements, and they know exactly how to make the distinction between representatives of the security establishment and Mossad, and who's a representative of the foreign ministry. We never hid who we are. And therefore, once you have such a breakthrough, and indeed, the Prime Minister deserves a lot of credit for the accords with the UAE and Bahrain, but ultimately an infrastructure, very significant infrastructure was established there for this opening. And when we were there, when we are there, there are 4 main levels. There's the diplomatic level, a lot of diplomatic political talks with elements in the foreign ministry and others in which we talked about the regional arena, what can be done, what cannot be done. But that was a more narrow circle. The second tier, or the second level, was the second minister was the economic minister, and a lot of business people and various Israeli civilian elements led by the foreign ministry, they traveled to Gulf countries, whether it was Oman, the UAE, or Bahrain, or other countries as well. Without the foreign ministry, they could never have gone there. Other elements do not promote trade relations. That's the second package. The third package, quite a few people-to-people activities were created, you know, to win the hearts and minds. Everybody looks at the peace accords with Jordan and Egypt, and regretfully, the difference, the gap there between the relationship between the governments and the security establishments and the street, the difference, the gap is immense there, and I'll soon say something about that. And we understood that, and this is why every once in a while we tried as much as we can to connect between elements from the civil society, and there was this tremendous investment in social media. The foreign ministry websites in Arabic are leading websites. We have over 100 exposures a month, a million from the entire region. And in this framework, we also hold surveys in the Arab world. It's no secret our situation in Egypt is not good at all. In Jordan, it's very bad. On the other hand, you know, first place where we did a survey or several surveys, who wants ties with Israel, the first ones was Iraq.
I'm not talking about the Kurds, I'm talking about Baghdad. This, we opened the virtual embassy in Iraq, which is one of our most active ones. So we invested a lot in social media. So when there is this breakthrough, and we were waiting for this surprise, and we do hope that it was created, that all that we did actually placed the infrastructure and the foundation. It's not like the cold peace with Egypt that one day we have to build everything from scratch. We are in a totally different situation concerning what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is doing today. And I set aside all the ceremonies as who is in the front and who is in the back. And the bottom line, I have to say that at the level of the professional officers, there's a good relationship and collaboration with all that is happening in the UAE. I went with a delegation and leading the professional ties with UAE, with the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the head of the NSC, the Director General of the Premier's Office, etc. There is truly an outstanding collaboration. There are partners, work groups, the Director Generals of different government agencies are leading, and the system understands there's something big happening. You can quarrel over the credit, but as soon as that opens, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not only a full partner, but is also a leader. This past week, I had the privilege of actually giving the Minister of Foreign Affairs the letter that allows them to open their mission, and they gave us a letter in which they announced that they will open embassies in Tel Aviv, and they invite us to open ours in Abu Dhabi. And ultimately, the ones who set up the missions, the ones who will operate these missions would be the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Nobody else knows how to do this. So I'm very, very happy to hear that people feared for the status of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but at least on the executive level, I'm very happy to say that we are in a totally different place in the context of our relations with the Gulf countries as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like to mention that in the survey that was mentioned, the question about, changing the roles or the personas serving as ministers of foreign affairs, and the fear was raised against Gabi Ashkenazi leaving his position. Ksenia is a member of Knesset. She is the head of the Israel Relations in the Middle East in the Mitvim Institute, and is a lecturer in Herzliya IDC. She will talk about the role of the Knesset and how she saw, from the eyes of a Knesset member, the functioning of the various government agencies, the political level, the diplomatic level, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ksenia, please. Okay, technology is now settled and we can start. Thank you. Thank you, Nimrod. I will try to not take more of the 7 minutes that were given to me, for the simple reason that we actually took a whole aspect of the foreign relations of the State of Israel with countries in the world, and specifically with Arab countries in the Middle East. And I think that it is exactly in those past 2 months when we hear about new agreements with neighboring countries, such as the UAE and Bahrain, the feeling of the Knesset in general as a body that should oversee the work of the government, and the feeling of the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee of the Knesset, in whose hands are the full powers of oversight and auditing the work of the government, this committee was totally left out of the negotiations and the processes, the diplomatic processes that took place, and astonished us, the rank and file, but not just the rank and file, even the experts. We never expected that. That was a good surprise for a change, but where is the Knesset in this entire process? I can say, as a person who sat in the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee of the 20th Knesset, regretfully, the Knesset in general is not carrying out its job as an authority that should very meticulously oversee processes led by the government. And specifically in the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, there were hardly any discussions about processes that were ripening at that time. Since the government was established in 2015, there were more and more talks about the possibility of having some sort of a process between us and the Gulf countries in 2016. Ministers traveled to these countries during 2016, 17, and 18. It was very very strange to me why the Knesset is not at all discussing the ramifications of those processes, the participation of different agencies within the government. Who was actually leading those processes, I wondered. The information was not available to members of Knesset who submitted questions, neither to me and other MKs who wanted to ask questions about them. We were rejected up front. They told us that they would not be answering these questions for security reasons. That is always the ultimate reason why no information is being released to the legislators concerning the work of the government, to know if it actually does its job in an optimal way. And I can tell you now, 2 years after, almost 2 years, that we in Mitvim have published recently a very interesting study concerning governmental tactics, concerning the relations with the region. And one of the key facts that we found there was the absence of an integrating body between the different agencies that work in this field. And as I said, the powers of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs indeed were very generously delegated among various entities. When there's prominence to the security establishment, and it's true that in the past 6 months we see more and more involvement and engagement and even leadership of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but we have to bear in mind that our relations with the region cannot be summed up only as strategic relations with Jordan and Egypt. Time and time again, we discover that the agencies that lead the communication with these countries are not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is perhaps engaged and involved, but they are not allowed to lead anything. And as it was said in one of the meetings of the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, we're actually nurturing those security affairs. When he was asked about the various aspects of our relations with Egypt, he said, so from what we can highlight here, we can say that the Knesset is in general very weak as an entity that should oversee the government, specifically weak in its Foreign Affairs and Security Committee that doesn't do its job for political reasons, avoids important processes and discussions concerning what is taking place right now before our eyes, not something that happened years ago. And the dominance of the security issues in the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, in contrast with Foreign Affairs issues and updates of the committee. The subcommittee for foreign affairs that was established within this committee convenes very, very seldom. Sometimes months go by without holding any in-depth discussions, or any discussions for that matter. In between discussions, months can pass by, and now with the corona, I'm sure it's even harder. Maybe it is easier because of the Zoom option, but in any case, these are very, very few discussions, and definitely not very frequent. As I said, concerning the findings that we brought up in our study together with Roee concerning the different governmental practices, we see many agencies in the security establishment and the various government ministries that are involved in foreign affairs. There's not one dominant integrating entity that divides the labor and jobs, defines them. There's competition concerning powers and authorities. I met with a number of European diplomats who told me that when they go to Israel, they never know who they will meet and from what ministry. And in our recommendations, we actually wanted to authorize one agency to integrate the relations with these specific countries in the Middle East, and would delineate a strategy on the matter. When the IDF prioritizes the security and defense and strategic relations, the foreign ministry believes that the civilian relations, the diplomatic relations, are the most important ones, and there has to be some sort of an agency that would tell us how to work with each and every one of those countries so as we do not decentralize these connections and spread them to different entities that do the same job. The State of Israel needs to have one address that would think about those collaborations, things that very often people don't think about, or other entities that are too weak to advance these topics in any strategic manner, to manage all the information that exists and quantities of information exist. We understand that the various agencies have huge bodies of knowledge, but when there are no collaborations, then they're not being tapped. And this is something that we truly need to improve and advance so that we'll have a lot more possibilities and a very clear paved way concerning very important processes that take place. I'd like to sum up and tell you that it's true that this is only the beginning of the process. This is a very important process of completing this matter of becoming, a part and parcel of the Middle East. Not only is the State of Israel not boycotted, but there are those who are seeking its closeness and friendship. And this necessitates a very clear discussion of these processes so that we start them the right way, on the right foot, regardless of various political inclinations. And they need to understand that together with these principles and with huge possibilities that open up to our country on the political, the diplomatic, the military, and the economic fields, there are significant challenges that we need to contend with. Various attempts of foreign entities to impact our policy here in Israel, the intervention of hackers, electronic army, and there are those countries that exploit these vis-a-vis those they consider their enemies, but also amongst friends, not only foes. We need to know how to work in collaboration between diverse entities that exist on this spectrum between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Strategy, the Ministry for Jerusalem Affairs, the IDF, Shabak, the Intelligence Directorate, etc. So I truly recommend that perhaps we publish the link to the position paper that we published concerning governmental practices, and that explains a great deal of the lacunas that exist. And in my view, and in the Mitvim view, the situations in which agreements are signed, even if these are important and historic procedures, but they are nonetheless are written without anyone in the Knesset or the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee ever witnessed. And there are others who say, we don't even know what we're talking about, and these agreements are already being signed. Of course, this must change, and it must function in a totally different way. Thank you, Ksenia. The fourth speaker, is Yael Ravia Tzedok, also from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She is VP Economy, and she will talk to us about the importance of economic diplomacy in the relations between Israel and its neighbors. She will tell us about key projects that take place between Israel and the Arab countries, with an emphasis on Jordan, with whom we have tough economic relations, and perhaps there we can advance things, and also to look at the great potential in the relations with the Gulf country and what to do so that we don't miss out on this chance. Yael, please. First of all, I'm very happy to be with you. Congratulations to Mitvim for your activities throughout the year. Yeah, the support that you give to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it definitely helps us, and I hope it helps you. You wanted me to talk about economic diplomacy, but perhaps I'll say first something more general concerning the economic diplomacy. Economic diplomacy is the growth engine of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ehud Iran talked about the challenging of opposed to ministries of foreign affairs, and we find ourselves leading a totally new agenda in diplomacy. The COVID challenge only highlighted the role played by the MFA, whether it has to do with the procurement of medical equipment or aviation issues that need to be settled with other elements of the system, connecting Israel to international programs, vaccines, etc., and also Israeli innovation innovation that is being leveraged in order to connect the capabilities of the State of Israel with other countries who experience COVID. And that's the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to make Israel relevant and an asset to other countries. From a survey that we conducted concerning the work of our missions in the past 2 years, the involvement of Israeli missions in advancing deals of Israeli companies, we reached the sum of $7.9 billion that the missions were involved in advancing one way or another. An ambassador is in the field and is familiar with people on the ground, knows how to open doors to companies and to make effective connections. $7.6 billion. The meaning is that if every 1 billion shekels of export creates 2,500 jobs, the meaning is that that advances the creation of 76,000 jobs for the Israeli economy and another 675 billions for the Israeli product. So definitely the Ministry of Foreign Affairs creates value, it's an asset, and contributes not only to the strategic and political security, but also the economic security of the State of Israel. So after this very important introduction, I'd like to say that in the last few months, we've been experiencing an extraordinary time of a very committed minister who asks and spurs and asks and learns and brings budgets and creates that political connection that is so necessary. The officers of the MFA work, identify opportunities and strive to realize them. It's true on the global level, but also in the Middle East and in the region. So as I said, the MFA is in the field, our ambassadors are in the field, they have access to decision makers. And let's put it this way, it is more challenged in the reality in the Middle East, but the fact that the mission knows how to map and identify a need and also to create the connections with business leadership or global companies that reside in certain countries, and it's true for the Middle Eastern area. If we identify the need, when there's a need, there's a way. And we saw this in the Middle East, and I can give you the example of Jordan in 2011, when we saw how the situation in Syria impacts the export possibilities of Jordan. We did our preparation work led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, together with government agencies, the private sector, and civil NGOs, and we designed the infrastructure so that when the Jordanian come and ask us to export their goods from the Haifa port, we'll be able to tell them that in 2 weeks that would be an option. And since 2012, the State of Israel has served as a terrestrial bridge for Jordan, and that happened even before the dramatic changes of the last few months. So I believe that identifying the need and the creation of connections that actually take either Israeli power or an Israeli need vis-a-vis the ability or the need of another country, these are important. I'll give you a small example, but it does attest to the potential of economic diplomacy in creating bonds. And that is the need of the Israeli high-tech in software engineers and people. We started advancing our activity in the past year and a half vis-a-vis Jordan in order to create that opportunity in which software engineers and employees in Jordan would be a place for outsourcing of Israeli companies. It was a process that we started, but it's hard to advance it because of COVID. It's impossible to have physical meetings and sessions, but that can win over many barriers and create connections that would provide Jordan with value. I'd like to give you an example from Egypt. The qualified industrial zones that operate in Egypt for almost 15 years provide employment for 300,000 households in Egypt. So it's true that the public opinion is quite challenging for us, and there are various barriers, but the knowledge that 300,000 households in Egypt, in the worst times even, earn their livelihood thanks to the peace with Israel, and the economic collaboration with Israel has great value, and it creates a very important anchor in a country such as Egypt. I'd like to also add and say that the gas discoveries changed the standing of the State of Israel in Israel and turned it into a major player and an exporter. The ENGF was mentioned here. The regional gas forum was an initiative of Minister of Energy Steinitz and the Egyptian minister. They created a coalition, and I believe it's a wonderful thing that 4 or 5 years ago was hard to conceive. I remember that in one of the conferences, I talked about the need to have regional collaboration so that all of us together will be able to exhaust the gas potential, and it sounded surreal to use these terms. And there you go, 3 or 4 years later, you have a regional gas forum or energy forum that serves the private sector, not just the governments, and it conveys a message of stability, and it can serve as an entity that would lure large companies to this region. Exporting gas to Egypt and to Jordan are also very, very important. So I said the relevance of the creation of collaborations that answer a certain need. Whenever there's a need, you can find a solution for them. And that's one of our missions, to identify those points where Israel can be of an asset to neighboring countries. Of course, the dramatic development of the past month and a half or 2 months, the Abraham agreements, you cannot but be so moved. You cannot undermine the importance of this development. The Americans have a leading role in this, and I think that indeed much was said about the fear of having the U.S. distance itself from the Middle East, but I see the U.S. very present here. I can see the Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of State being involved in those processes, and that too is a statement. Perhaps they're not as engaged as in the past, but it's too early to lament American presence in the region. There's no doubt that in the relations that are being woven with EAU, we see the enthusiasm of the business community and also building the infrastructure, and that's our role of the government. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs definitely plays a central role, and the NSC and the Premier's office. We work with all the rest of the agencies with an emphasis on those working in the economic field. In the visit that we had last week, very important agreements were signed, and these lay the infrastructure for accelerated economic activities. The airports agreement was signed, the short agreement. It is the first country of visa exemptions was signed with, and also encouraging and protection of investments. These agreements will build trust in the business communities, both in the Emirates and in Israel, and prove that we mean business. We mean doing business with them. We see delegations that come and go, and I'd like to say one thing. First of all, the MFA has a history of advancing economic ties, even when it was under guise or behind the scenes. And we advanced activities of over 500 companies in the Gulf countries, and we did this thanks to the knowledge we have, the expertise that we've gained, and the ties that we have. Today we can discuss it, but there were other times that we couldn't even mention it, and sometimes it's very frustrating to see others getting the credit for it, but we were highly focused in this role, together with other economic institutions, the Ministry of Export, on building that layer of economic ties. The mission in Iran that was opened in 2019 with the presence of an Israeli diplomat, that's a permanent mission. That was also a foot in the door, even though it was very focused on the needs of the mission in Abu Dhabi. But that was a very important move. The Americans did not only spread their political and diplomatic umbrella and pave the way, but they came with an initiative of having a triple foundation for the Emirates, the Americans, and Israel of $3 billion that is supposed to support the different projects led by the private sector and developing other initiatives for regional economic development. This is a very important tool. And I'm saying this again, it's important to talk, but we also need to walk the walk and create the tools and the infrastructure that would allow the business community to advance projects. And I also mean commerce and projects of infrastructures. I believe that the vision of Israel Katz of the peace railroads, some criticize this vision, but I believe that today it seems totally feasible, and still there's work that needs to be done, and I think that our approach should change and our view should be more regional and wide. It's not only bilateral, but also to be helped and to build partnerships with other international conglomerates that can be found in the Emirates, whether it's German or Arabian or French, and not to compete against them, but to create partnership. That would open new opportunities for Israel vis-a-vis other European and Asian companies. One last point that I would like to talk about is Expo 2021. The MFA led the building the Israeli booth of the Expo exhibition that would take place in the Gulf for the first time. It was postponed to 2021. This is not only going to be a very impressive booth with very impressive presentations. 25 million people are supposed to visit this booth, but to also create thematic delegations on topics that are of interest to the region, be it issues of smart transportation, high precision agriculture, desertification, water desalination, irrigation, telemedicine, medical research and studies, cyber protection, renewable energies, all those things that characterize other issues that are of concern to society, women, minorities, the elderly, etc. It's important to mention this because a new world of possibilities opens up. The MFA is a leading actor in making these possibilities available to the Israeli economy and private sector, and to create that connections that couldn't have been imagined beforehand, but they do turn into a reality today. This is our mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Yael. We are about to finish the session, and I'd like to take at least 5 minutes to give a brief question to each speaker, and to you, Udi and Ksenia, each one of you in your own ways involved in civil diplomacy, whether it's through academic collaborations or your journalistic work in your career, and you even wrote a book about it recently. If you could very, very briefly mention an insight regarding the importance of these civilian ties and work with Arab countries in a non-official manner, whether it's as academics or journalists. Well, let me just say that Israel must encourage in every possible way the collaboration and cooperation between citizens in order to build bridges of cooperation and peace, not just between organizations and not just between military personnel, because this is what characterizes our relationship with both Egypt and Jordan, but we must advance broader, much more extensive ties that go beyond what has been so far in the Arab world. The Arab countries, of course, countries that are, that are kingdoms with kings, and maybe there's a person or one group of people who are the decision makers, but we cannot ignore the weight of the elites and their interest in the economy, their interest in dialogue and research. And I learned from my ties, the ties I had developed over the years, that people on the other side are very curious about us. They want to know. They actually want to know so much about us. There's this entire trend in all Middle Eastern countries, not just in Saudi Arabia with the Saudi bloggers and others. We can see more and more people who are studying Hebrew, who are learning about Israel, even in Egypt and in other places, even sometimes if it, costs them their freedom, their liberty, or their career, but they're still very much interested in us. So We don't want to find ourselves in 25 years' time as we convene, hopefully not on Zoom. Hopefully things are better by then. And as we look back at the ties developed with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain, maybe with other countries in the region, and we'll say we missed our opportunity because we left it only to official elements, and mainly people from the security establishment, and these quite naturally already know each other. I mean, there is already trade in arms and commerce, and that exists, but we mustn't, neglect that if we want to instill content, genuine substance into these agreements. And once again, I go back to this statement that, as a citizen or even as a Knesset member representing Israel at the time, I was pretty shocked by that statement that people said, we think that civil relations are not that important. The only important thing is that we have cooperation with between the Egyptian army and the Israeli army in the Gaza border, for example, but one doesn't rule out the other. It's important to foster ties with these countries that we used to have wars with. These relations used to be very hostile. Sometimes it's even very hostile. This hostility hasn't necessarily hasn't disappeared necessarily, and we have to grapple with that, not just with the tweets of Ayatollah Khamenei. And I think that right now this development has to be much more natural and much more rapid, and we see a clear-cut, very obvious interest of Emirati research institutes and others. They show a great interest in us, and we better not miss that train. We have to see how we build this, and this is where the diplomats go in, as well as scholars and academics who have researched these countries, who know what the code of conduct is, how to dress for meetings, how to speak with people, what can be even expected from this collaboration. Thank you very much. Ksenia, Udi, would you like to add anything? Yes, I'd like to say something very brief. I concur with what Ksenia said, and of course, from my perspective as an academic, I believe that dialogue with my counterparts in the Arab world is very important. There is a certain opportunity here with the Gulf countries. At least in recent years, some of the leaders talked about the fact that education and opening up academic institutions are very important to them. They invited American institutions. Some of them are no longer there. There's a lot of collaboration with American universities and Gulf countries, for example, Georgetown and NYU. And if we are talking honestly about an encounter between societies, between a society that's open with an open academic complex. The question is, with our counterparts, how open are the societies there? Can you truly strive for sincere research in an academic world? That's a bit similar to the diplomatic world that we talked about Israel, which was under British and American dominance since World War II. And now we see a certain change there as well. And that will compel us in academia to think beyond the US and Britain. And I'm certain that there will be opportunities there as well. Thank you very much indeed. In our activities in Mitvim Institute, we can see how ties are being fostered with institutions in the UAE, including memorandums for collaboration. And there are other ties, less official, with other elements in the region. Haim and Yael, now I move on to you briefly with respect to Jordan. Jordan and the Palestinians, in our surveys, we see that the people in Israel attribute less and less importance to the peace accords with Jordan. It's been the anniversary of these peace accords this past week, and it went out and it was almost completely unmentioned. So what do you think about that? What is the role of the foreign ministry? And this is where we can see the most obvious affiliation between the ties with the Arab countries and the Palestinian issue. If you could just address this very briefly, because we have the Knesset members who are waiting for their turn to speak. Nimrod, I will answer very briefly that I think a regional opportunity has been created here that could be beneficial to all regional countries. Both Jordan and Palestine can be involved in many projects that will contribute to well-being, economic success. I wouldn't underestimate any peace accords with any country. These are very important. They give us great security, and hopefully these new winds of peace and of economic ties will trickle down and expand and impact the well-being and economy of all nations living in this country, in this region. Thank you. Haim, would you like to add anything? Let me repeat what I said. I truly hope I definitely concur with what Ksenia said, both about the Gulf countries and Jordan. They weren't really disappointed because for them, Israel has a great power, and the reason was they weren't really exposed to Israel. We have this image as if we're omnipotent, and now that everybody's, going for the Gulf area, hopefully will meet the expectations, because their expectations at least are above and beyond, especially in the Emirates, as whether it's business and culture, Israeli culture and Israeli tourists, and hopefully we won't disappoint them, we won't let them down. And as for Jordan, I think that Jordan, I led the negotiations on the Aram Naharaim area. It was a very painful point. The Jordanians, they and the Palestinians are connected to each other, and I think that they've started to internalize over the past few weeks. They've began to realize that something significant has happened here, and the more they lag behind, if they continue to lag behind, they'll continue to lose out. And perhaps this is what will truly change and will lead the Jordanians. I don't know about the Palestinians, but definitely the Jordanians, because ultimately Jordan is under great difficulties, and when they look to the left and to the right, their most significant support or their ability to develop significant things in trade, in business, is Israel, not Syria, not Iraq, or other countries in the region. And I think that the fact that the issue of annexation is off the table, and the fact that countries, I mean, the UAE is a very important ally of Jordan, Bahrain to a certain extent. So you see, perhaps this certain line will be drawn and they'll say, okay, we get it, we need to recalculate, and perhaps the Palestinians also will revisit the entire situation. But everybody's saying right now, first of all, let's wait for November 3rd for the election results. And this is excuse everybody's using, and maybe it could be, I mean, just like everybody else, we're just waiting for next week to see how things evolve. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Mitvim Institute for this conference. Thank you. I'd like to thank all the speakers in this session. You gave us a comprehensive picture from within the government system and from outside, and these interfaces are very, very important to us. And this leads us straight back to the parliament, to the Knesset, which Ksenia mentioned with our two last speakers for today, Knesset member Nitzan Horowitz and Knesset member Aida Tuma Sliman. Nitzan Horowitz, the chair of Meretz, who was the chairman of the Security and Foreign Affairs Committee, the chair of the lobby for the European and Israel relations. He used to be a journalist covering foreign news, and he can definitely address the different angles on the agenda of both the Institute and the conference. We're delighted to have you with us today, Nitzan, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Nimrod. I'd like to thank all the dear participants and guests. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, in the brief time I have, I'll try to address several points. First of all, with respect to the Emirates and the new agreements with the Arab countries, and on the Palestinian issue, I'll also talk about Europe and the US. As for the new accords, we're talking about the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. I need to make a point clear. In contrast to various rumors or claims, we support these agreements. We think that these agreements are important and we support them. And yet, this argument of the government and of the Israeli right that these accords seal and completely finish off the Palestinian issue, I think it's a lie, it's deceitful, and it undermines Israeli interest. It's not true, because the condition for the accords with the UAE was the cancellation of the annexation, and of course there were also the planes, the airplane transaction in the case of Sudan, to take them off the blacklist of terror-supporting countries, etc. But the Palestinian issue was definitely part of it. So first of all, that's a lie. And the second point, the fact that the undermining of Israeli interests, we don't think that progress in the negotiations with the Palestinian is some kind of a favor that we do for the Palestinians, but I believe it to be an essential Israeli interest, so we can live in peace and security here in our country in a Jewish and democratic state. Therefore, all this charade or the way they use these new accords in order to cancel, to protest, to take off the table the Palestinian issue is misleading, it's harmful, and we say that this is our position. We support the accords and normalization of Israel with every country in the region. We think that what's even more important is that we make progress with the Palestinians, our neighbors, with whom we share this land, and we should do it based on a two-state solution. Ultimately, even the Trump plan, the plan of the century, which I wasn't a great advocate of, even that plan talks about a Palestinian state in the majority of the territory, and I believe that this is where we need to strive towards for the implementation of the two-state solution. I would prefer to see the new accords with the Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, maybe there will be others, as a means to maybe make this, to facilitate this and to enable progress. I definitely don't accept this claim or this formula. It's as if Netanyahu has proven that we don't need the Palestinians. What do you mean you don't need the Palestinians? We need the Palestinians. They are our neighbors. They are right over here, and they are the ones we need to reach an agreement with, and that is our position, and it's a very clear one. As for Europe, I'd like to say something about what I define as a progressive approach to Israeli foreign policy. In recent years, and because of Netanyahu and because of other developments in the world, for example, Trump and other governments, other prime ministers and presidents in Europe and in South America, we see the rise of reactionary, anti-democratic, anti-liberal governments. And it is with these governments, these leaders, that Israel is deepening its relations, and it does so, regretfully, at the expense of its relationship with democratic, liberal countries. And ultimately, the most basic interest of Israel, let's say with respect to Europe, is to have a very profound alliance with these democratic countries that have always stood by us, and they have always been our true allies, whether it is France or Germany, for example. And this axis that has been formed with countries that have a very clear anti-democratic policy, for example, Poland, Hungary, other countries in Eastern Europe. Perhaps, it is necessary to have an alliance with them. I'm not naive. I know that most countries in the world don't have a democratic regime, but as far as Israel's interest is concerned, Israel definitely needs to invest great efforts, great resources in order to maintain the relationship. And this idea that we've witnessed for several years now, that the EU is a hostile entity, that they are anti-Israeli, that they're our enemy, that the socialist parties in Europe are hostile towards Israel, are Israel rivals, simply because they support a two-state solution. I believe that this is a completely flawed and mistaken idea. I understand why it is taking hold, and it does serve internal domestic goals both there and here. But if we look at the Israeli interest, we have nothing to look for in these countries. And it's important to understand that Israel is essentially a democratic country. If we decide that we are no longer part of the democratic family, then we can search our luck elsewhere. But our democratic essence does not allow us to distance ourselves in such a manner from countries, from governments that are democratic and liberal. And once again, I give the example of Germany and France and the EU as an organization. When I hear the way the Israeli right talks about them, I am quite shocked and appalled at times. And this takes me to the most prominent example that has other aspects, and that is the Democratic Party in the US. I'm not saying this just because maybe, and I hope I'm not hiding this. You know what my views are. I do hope that Joe Biden will win these elections. But even if we weren't talking about elections, if this weren't election time, because this is something I said 2 and 3 years ago, and even during the time of Obama, Netanyahu's policy to put all the Israeli eggs in the Republican basket to create a severe rift, a severe schism with the Democratic Party in the U.S., it's completely erroneous with respect to the interest of Israeli policy. And we're talking now from the perspective of Israeli foreign policy. Israel's asset has always been that Israel was a matter of bipartisan consensus in the U.S. You know, it went across the aisle, as they say. Both Democrats and Republicans supported Israel, and now it has been broken in recent years, and the Israeli government and Netanyahu has a key role in this trend. And here we can talk about something else, and that is the Jewish issue in the U.S. And maybe not all Israelis are aware of that. Maybe others prefer to ignore this. There is a very high correlation in the U.S. between the Jewish community and voting for the Democratic Party. And of course, that's not new. This has been the case since the beginning of the 20th century, since masses of Jews immigrated to the U.S. In every presidential election conducted in the U.S. since the beginning of the 20th century, a vast majority of American Jews voted for the Democratic Party. And that is not going to change as well. It has to do with all kinds of deep reasons. I'm not going to get into that, but it's a basic fact. The fact that the Israeli government is spitting in the face of the Democratic Party, is spitting in the face of the Jewish community's political affiliation with the Democratic Party, is boycotting organizations like J Street, progressive organizations, Tikkun Olam organizations, peace-promoting organizations of the Jewish community in the U.S. identified with the American liberal left. This is causing great damage to the Israeli interest. I think it's the wrong thing to do anyhow, and it is misguided, but I'm now focusing on Israel's interest. But I have to say that this simply is a deed that cannot be done. And Netanyahu could ostensibly say, well, you know what, I succeeded. Look how many things Trump did for Israel. But this could all change next week. And then what? And then what? I don't want to reach a situation in which Israel will experience a schism, a rift with the U.S. I think it's destructive, it's intolerable, it's harmful, and I think that a vast majority, a huge majority of Israelis won't accept that, and neither will most American, or rather American Jews. And we need to take a sober, logical, normal approach. We must look at we must look at our shared values. We must look at our interests, the vast Jewish community in the U.S. and what it feels. It's such an immense support for the state of Israel. It is the foundation of Zionism. We need to look at our political and security interests. We need to look at everything that's happening, and we must understand what a grave mistake it was to sever the relations with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, if anybody would have told me 10 years ago that a right-wing government in Israel would sever their relations with the Democratic Party, I would say that that person is insane, because even the Israeli right understood that we mustn't do that. But this has happened in recent years. And there's a major crisis, and we needed to fix that. And to conclude, I think that the state of Israel, once again, we do have realpolitik issues. There are agreements. There are countries in the world. There are tyrannic countries in the world. I understand that. I'm not ignoring that. This is the world that we live in. I don't think we need to be so enthusiastic about our relations with some kind of very strange leaders in the world. And ultimately, our place, and this is something that most Israeli citizens will agree on, we belong to the enlightened world. We belong to the liberal democratic world, a world that defends human rights, that protects civilian equality, and tries to resolve conflicts in peaceful ways. I have no illusions that if this current government in Israel will continue, this policy will change, because the policy won't change as long as Netanyahu is in office, because that's his declared policy. But I do hope that if there is a change, and it will be a dramatic change in the US, if we will see a change of administration next week, I hope this will lead the government in Jerusalem to revisit, to rethink the directions of its foreign policy. I hope that they will understand that we cannot behave as if we were an extreme right-wing country. Maybe we are. Indeed, we have an extreme right-wing government. I'm sorry to say that, but even that government has enough sane people. At least I'm talking about the people from Kahol-Lavan, from blue and white, and they must understand that they have nothing to look for over there. Yes, they need to maintain a relationship, and it's important to have a relationship with countries that perhaps are not that nice, but the affiliation, the proximity, that's what we have with the democratic and liberal world, and this is where we must be. Thank you very much, Nitzan. Member Knesset of Horowitz, the chairperson of Meretz, and our last speaker in the conference is Knesset member Aida Tuma-Sliman from Hadash and the joint slate. She used to be the head of the Committee for the Advancement of Women's Status and for Gender Equality. She speaks often in the media advocating feminist causes. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours. Yes, I'm sorry, I was on mute. I was listening to Nitzan. So, good evening, everyone. Truth be told, I think that we are, or you are holding this conference, and you are hosting us at a time that seems perhaps like the best period, with peak moments of Israeli and regional politics, as Netanyahu's government, the Israeli government, informs us every other day of an ostensibly peace accord signed with yet another Arab country and another Arab country. All of them, by the way, definitely match Nitzan's descriptions regarding the connection between Netanyahu's government and the right-wing governments, and the governments that oppress their people, both in Europe and in Africa, and now also in the Gulf countries, in the Arab world, in our region. These countries are ruled by governments that, definitely don't match these definitions. I mean, we are talking about connections of the right wing from every angle, and I think that despite the general impression that the regional policy of Netanyahu's government is at the peak of its success, I believe that we are at a low point that's taking us downhill to a place where it will be even more complicated than the current situation that we're trying to escape in order not to confront. And they call all the trade agreements that were recently developed, I consider them to be economic accords, and yet they call them peace accords, and they try to divert our attention from a genuine attempt to try to invest in a solution to a situation that that has led us from the outset to define that Israel is in a conflict situation. And the way I see it, it's in a situation that it is ruling another country, that it has conquered another nation, or as we say in PC language in Israel, that we are in conflict. But if to say the truth, the state of Israel is still occupying both lands and a people, a different nation, and is acting in order to build more and more settlements. Netanyahu turned regional politics, his regional politics, into an alibi to continue the occupation. On the one hand, he implements the plan of the century, his and Trump's plan, and I'm surprised that people are still saying that it strives to establish a Palestinian state, because anybody who reads this plan carefully knows that this is a plan for the elimination of the option for a Palestinian state. It's actually a plan for annexation, for mega annexation, and there's no need for the Emirates to reject it or accept it, because ultimately the peace accords with the UAE is part of the plan. It's actually one of the steps that will ultimately lead to this mega annexation that we are talking about. So how can we measure this, whether this policy is truly leading to a better situation? We need to, and peace, we need to examine these accords. Are they promoting us towards genuine peace? Peace in the sense that guarantees both human safety and security to the people, and not just a state of non-war. There are states that are states of non-war, but we are talking about peace situations here. I believe that these accords are pushing us away from that if we all agree that this region cannot live in peace, and if we think that it is impossible for us, the people of Israel, to feel the peace without ending the main problem which continues to exist, which is occupation of the Palestinian people, then actually if these accords serve the purpose of eliminating and isolating the Palestinians and force them to accept the plan in which they hardly receive land and to call that a Palestinian state, well, in this sense and from that angle, these accords cannot be considered peace accords. Do these accords serve the interests of the people, of the nations? I'm talking about both those who live inside Israel, both the Palestinian people and the Arab countries around. I believe that they do not. Even though you see all these economic celebrations, ultimately this economic celebration, the main ones who will profit from it are the rich people, the capitalists in these countries, whether if it's in Israel or the Emirates and Bahrain, and you know, who knows what they'll profit from that in Sudan. And I think that we have opened, or you know, I won't take the blame on me. I won't say that we did, but Netanyahu and his government have started an arms race. They have opened the door to an arms race in this region, which is very dangerous. Ever since these peace accords have been signed, we keep hearing only about preparations for war and acquiring aircrafts and the purchase of military artifacts.
This is something that cannot be a situation that somebody who signed this agreement ever thought that we're entering a new era of peace. So the second point is that this triangular alliance that was created between the administrations in Bahrain or the Emirates or Sudan and Israel and the US, until the 3rd of November at least, this triangular alliance created around it a business community that is focusing on energy, cyber, and weapons. And we hear more and more about the procurement of capabilities, intel capabilities, and trading in aircraft. This is not the atmosphere of peace. This is the atmosphere of preparation for war. This is the atmosphere that in the military language they will tell me and teach me that it's a matter of deterrence. Deterring who? Deterring who? This axis that Netanyahu has built vis-a-vis Iran and certain countries in the Arab world. This means preparations for a new conflict and a new war that people want to bring us into. And this is a situation of a takeover, perhaps not a hostile takeover, maybe a more pleasant one under the guise of peace. It is taking over other peoples in the regular economic way without the use of an army. And nonetheless, they are taking over all the resources that exist in those other countries and can exist there. What I am most frightened of in this situation is that those who think that it's possible to have regional politics in which Israel has normal relations and yet tramples the Palestinian people and ignoring its real problem, and that is the continuation of the occupation, leaves us a very heavy legacy that might explode in our faces any day. Trump and Netanyahu might leave, and I certainly hope that they do leave soon, their status, this one as head of state and that one as president of the United States of America. But in the meantime, they managed, and I believe that in the reticence and the acceptance and the happiness that everyone expressed, they managed to plant in us major barriers and root to real peace in the future. Why am I saying this? Because when it comes to Jerusalem and when it comes to normalization and when it comes to the confrontation and the isolation of the Palestinian people, all this will make it very difficult for us in the future to solve the problem for which all the citizens of the State of Israel feel that they do not live in peace. And this is why we talk about the Palestinian issue and the continuation of the occupation. The question that we as citizens of the State of Israel must ask, and mostly the Jewish majority, including the Zionist left, we should ask ourselves what kind of a future and a state do we want to live in? Because for the time being, Netanyahu is building the apartheid state, and the applause and the joy and the happiness when witnessing those steps building the apartheid state do not help us in building a real, genuine democracy and end the occupation. Hence, I believe that this is the time to say things in the most clear way, to say that the moments of success that are being registered are nothing but the beginning of a very worrisome deterioration. Thank you very much, MK Aida Tuma Sliman. And with that, we are closing the conference. We heard political points of view and perspectives with different emphases. We listened to experts, people of the MFA. We reviewed and surveyed various regions. We talked about the status of the MFA, the importance of the progress in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and changes that took place this past year that we never expected expected to happen. And that's a very good point to end our annual conference and to start thinking about the next one. We do not know what regional reality is awaiting for us next year, but we do know what we need to do in order to get there, to strengthen Israeli diplomacy, to deepen Israel's integration in the region, and to advance Israeli-Palestinian peace. You're invited to follow up on our activities on Facebook and Twitter, and also in the media in different places, and we'll try to make accessible to you all of our insights concerning the state of Israel in the region and how to improve its status. Thank you for staying with us in an era of very short Zoom conferences. To sit for 3 hours is something that we truly appreciate. This is a partnership that is very important to us on the organizational level, and we'd be very happy to stay in touch. Thank you to the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, to the people of the Institute, Merav, Roee, Arnon, Gabi, Elie, Arik, and all the other staff members and the speakers, of course, and see you in our next conferences.